Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into silks, lighting a few too many candles, and diving into the secret, steamy, and occasionally jaw-dropping lives of medieval queens. The rumours, the power plays, the barely concealed scandals, yeah, all of it. Just a heads up, if you were expecting gentle tiaras and courtly modesty, you're in for a ride. And let's be honest, you probably won't survive this. Not because of swords or poison, but because your sense of reality is going to get absolutely wrecked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me your city and the time right now. I want to know where in the world you're listening from as we spiral into royal decadence. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink into a haze of warm, perfumed steam. The walls around you are marble, glistening, golden, and somewhere nearby someone is laughing, low and rich, like wine being poured. Welcome to the court of Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, 12th century France. More specifically, you're in her bathhouse, a place that's somehow both a sanctuary and a trap. Eleanor doesn't believe in dull days. She's not your average medieval queen. She grew up riding horses like a knight and quoting Latin love poetry like it was foreplay. Her court is a fever dream of musicians, poets, knights and troubadours. But not the chaste kind. These aren't love songs whispered to distant ladies. No, this is raw, electric desire wrapped in rhyme and velvet. Tonight, the scent in the air is rosewater and cinnamon. The bathwater is laced with herbs. Eleanor lounges in a private tub, her hair coiled up with delicate strands of pearls, her eyes sharp and amused. Around her, her ladies-in-waiting trade glances and secrets. You don't speak the language, but you don't need to. They're discussing someone's recent performance, and it's not in a tournament. Here's the thing about Eleanor's court. It's not all flirtation and metaphor. This place gave birth to the court of love, where Eleanor and other noblemen presided like judges, debating questions of romance, passion and fidelity. That sounds classy, right? Except when the topic turns to things like, is it more pleasurable to love in secret or in public? Or, can a married woman truly love anyone but her husband? The verdicts weren't always PG. Sometimes they bordered on softcore legal rulings. There's one troubadour, Bernard de Ventadour, who becomes Eleanor's obsession for a while. He writes about her skin, her laugh, her refusal to be owned. Some historians say their connection was only poetic. Others, well, they point out the private songs, the locked garden encounters, and the sudden need to send him away. Too close, too public, too tempting. Not to be outdone, Eleanor marries not once but twice, first to Louis VII of France, then to Henry VI of England. The first marriage fizzles spectacularly. Louis is pious, grim, and allergic to pleasure. Eleanor, meanwhile, hosts feasts with naked dancers in Aquitaine, and allegedly joins the Second Crusade in armour just to stir things up. The second marriage is passion-filled, violent, and messy. Henry cheats constantly. Eleanor plots rebellions. They may not make love in the end, but they sure make headlines. Now, lean in. Here's one of the juiciest bits. Eleanor's court had secret rites. At least that's the fringe theory. A few scholars claim that behind closed tapestries, the Queen and her closest women gathered to enact symbolic romantic trials. Think blindfolds, whispered accusations, and maybe some very creative punishments. There's a letter, half deciphered, that mentions a midnight circle and a kiss of truth. It could be innocent, but you know better. The line between ritual and kink gets blurry when everyone's wearing perfume and velvet gloves. But was Eleanor truly as sensual and scandalous as the legends say? That's the scholarly tug-of-war. Some argue she's been mythologized, painted as a seductress by later writers to make her more entertaining or threatening. Others say the consistency of the rumours means something had to be going on. After all, a woman that powerful, that clever, and that unapologetically in control? People were going to talk. Maybe they had to. Either way, you're left standing in that steam-filled room, watching history breathe through silk. Eleanor catches your eye, just for a second. Her look says, "You think you know how queens behave? You really don't. Not yet." The heat shifts. Now it's thicker, more humid, with a pulse of incense and candle smoke that clings to your skin like sweat. The bathhouse fades, and in its place rises the towering golden domes of Constantinople, Byzantium in its decadent prime. You can hear the echo of sandals on polished mosaic floors and the faint rhythmic chanting from a distant church. But that's not where you're headed. No, you're slipping into the life of a woman who started with little more than her body and her wit, and somehow seduced an empire. Empress Theodora. She doesn't arrive wrapped in silks. She arrives on stage, barefooted and radiant under oil lamps, as a mime, dancer and actor of the more interactive variety. You're told the performances were uninhibited. One chronicler, clearly sweating as he wrote it, describes Theodora miming erotic acts with geese. Geese. You feel both intrigued and a little uncomfortable. That's the mood of Theodora's early years. Equal parts, allure and chaos. Her beauty is documented. Wide eyes, striking presence, and a voice that could command silence. But it's her ambition that lifts her from the gutter to the palace. She captures the eye of Justinian, heir to the Byzantine throne, not just for her looks, though sure that helped, but for her mind. He's hooked, and you, standing in the candlelit shadows of their courtship, get the sense that their pillow talk probably involved theology, politics, and ways to destabilize rivals. When Justinian proposes, there's a problem. Law forbids senators from marrying actresses, so naturally he changes the law. That's love, or lust with imperial funding. Now Empress, Theodora keeps her past close, not hidden, just sharpened. She supports laws protecting women from forced prostitution. She funds safe houses. She reforms marriage rights. But in private, her power takes a darker edge. There are whispers. You hear them now, in the hissing tongues of courtiers passing wine too quickly. Stories about Theodora's night court, a small circle of select ladies and eunuchs who gathered late at night, not for prayer, but for pleasures both mental and physical. There's one story about her personal bathhouse located just off the imperial bedroom, where scented oils were warmed and certain guests were tested before meeting with her husband. You try not to ask what tested means, but it involves eye contact and very little clothing, and then there's the infamous blue versus green rivalry. In Byzantium, sports teams were everything, especially chariot racing factions, the blues and the greens. Theodora was a blue. That's not just a fan base, that's a gang allegiance, and when the Nika riots erupt in 532, threatening to burn the city to ash, Justinian wants to flee. But Theodora, she stands. Her speech to the court is cold, calm, lethal. Royalty is a fine burial shroud. Translation: better to die in silk than run in shame. That moment cements her legend. But some historians say it wasn't just bravery. According to fringe accounts, Theodora had leverage. She knew secrets, lovers, trysts, pressure points in high society. That's why she stayed. Not just courage, but control. There's a lesser-known detail, something scholars debate even now. A mosaic in the church of San Vitale shows Theodora holding a golden chalice. Eyes forward, expression unreadable. Some say it's a sign of sanctity. Others point out the veil she wears, the same kind used in ancient pagan rites dedicated to goddesses of love and fertility. Coincidence? Maybe. But once you start seeing symbols, it's hard to stop. Another curious detail. She never had children, officially. But rumours linger about a daughter she bore in her performing years, hidden away in a convent or perhaps passed off as another noble's child. It's never confirmed, never denied. Just one more knot in her tapestry of calculated mystery. And let's not forget the scholars themselves. Some idolise her. Others call her a manipulative courtesan who used sex as a ladder and piety as camouflage. Was she a reformed sinner, or a secret libertine all the way through? The debate goes in circles, each side more dramatic than the last. You walk the palace now, past shadowy colonnades and under ceilings painted with divine scenes that feel just a little too voyeuristic. You wonder how much of Theodora's power came from what she kept hidden. Desires weaponized, past loves reimagined, sensuality turned into imperial doctrine. One moment she's bathing in milk and honey, the next she's drafting legal reforms with ink still damp from her own hand. As you move through the last hallway, you pause beside a thick velvet curtain. Behind it, maybe nothing, or maybe a room where Theodora, empress and seductress, once lay with a lover who would later find himself politically erased. A century later, monks would burn her image from scrolls, calling her unholy, wicked, a Jezebel in silk. But her mosaics remain, her laws remain, her legend, too wild to fully believe, too real to fully deny, also remains. And so you step away, dazed, trailing the scent of myrrh and rose oil, and just slightly dizzy from what may have been the most sensual imperial power grab in history. Now you're walking down narrow Parisian streets, damp stone beneath your feet, the scent of burning pine clinging to your cloak. It's the early 15th century and the city is restless. War outside the gates, rumours inside them. But your destination isn't some battlefield or monastery. It's the Hotel St. Paul, a royal residence tucked behind guarded doors, where Queen Isabeau of Bavaria lives in a cocoon of silks, mirrors, and, according to her critics, every earthly pleasure known to medieval France. From the outside, Isabeau is every inch the queen. Elegant gowns, jewelled headpieces, a taste for imported Italian perfume. But inside the court, she's a whispered scandal. You hear it immediately. The courtiers talk in low, hissing voices about her supposed lovers, her extravagant spending, and her strange relationship with her son, the Dauphin. One of them mentions a window game, and you immediately regret asking. Isabeau arrived in France as a teenage bride to Charles VI, who would later become known as Charles the Mad. That alone would send most people into a spiral, but Isabeau handles it with flair. When Charles starts thinking he's made of glass, literally, Isabeau doesn't run. She rules in his name, sometimes from the throne, sometimes from her bed. It depends who you ask. Here's the deal. In medieval Paris, queens weren't supposed to be visible. They were expected to stay behind the scenes, silent, veiled, symbolic. But Isabeau? She's out in public, dressed like a goddess, riding in gold carriages, hosting midnight feasts where masks stay on just a little too long. The common people adore her at first. Then they don't. The nobles never really trust her. And the historians? They either love her or want her tried posthumously for treason and bad taste. There's a detail, quirky but real, that keeps coming up. Isabeau had a thing for mirrored ceilings. Not just one or two, but several chambers with polished panels that reflected everything happening below. Innocent decor. Maybe. Or maybe she liked watching. Or being watched. Or both. And let's talk about the bedroom politics. She allegedly had a rotating series of lovers, including her own brother-in-law, the Duke of Orleans. One chronicler claims she was found in the Duke's lap during a council meeting. Another says she met him regularly in her milk bath chamber, a room that sounds relaxing until you hear it may have doubled as a meeting spot for lovers and spies. No one agrees on the specifics, but the milk part is real. She bathed in it weekly. It was supposed to preserve her youth, or her mystery, probably both. Now, lean in closer, here comes the weird. Some pamphlets from the time, early propaganda. Really, accuse Isabeau of participating in dark rituals meant to keep the king docile and the crown in her control. Animal blood, candles, whispered incantations. Most scholars roll their eyes, but a few admit that the descriptions align a little too well with certain court records. Nighttime visitors, sudden mood shifts in the king, and unexplained deaths among the staff. But the big one, the story no one can agree on, is the rumour of incest. You're hesitant to even think it. But there it is, sprawled across documents and whispered in alleys, that Isabeau had an unnatural closeness with her eldest son, the Dauphin. Some said they bathed together, even when he was a teen. Others claimed she arranged his marriage not to cement power, but to control it, intimately. These accusations were mostly levelled by political enemies trying to discredit her. But the very fact they stuck says something about how Isabeau was viewed. Not just powerful, but threateningly erotic. Now pause. Because here's the scholarly question. Was Isabeau actually indulgent and manipulative? Or was she just a woman trying to survive in a court full of jealous men and unstable kings? Modern historians have pointed out that most of the accusations came from biased chroniclers with reasons to hate a foreign queen wielding French power. The incest stories? Possibly planted. The mirrored ceilings? Maybe just luxury. Maybe. Still, when you walk her palace now, you feel a strange unease. The air is heavy with rose oil and politics. There are masks on the wall, literal ones from court masquerades, each with slightly parted lips and empty eyes, and there's one long corridor with a carpet so soft your steps vanish beneath you. At the end is a door, a mirrored door. You open it. The ceiling above is pure reflection, distorted, fogged with time, but unmistakably designed to catch everything that happens below. Isabeau's bed is still there, or at least the frame, carved with lions. Draped in velvet so dark it looks like bruises. You imagine her there, sipping spiced wine, listening to her rivals argue outside her chambers, knowing she'll outlast most of them. And she does. Kind of. After her death, her name becomes a cautionary tale. Too foreign, too decadent, too much. But some modern scholars defend her fiercely. She protected her children. She ruled during her husband's madness. She kept the court together when France nearly fell apart. Still, the mirrored ceilings remain. So does the wine-stained record of whispered affairs and veiled glances. And so do you, standing there, wondering how much was slander and how much was just too delicious to be forgotten. You're standing on a muddy battlefield now, not in armour, not even close. You're in a borrowed cloak that smells like wet wool and someone else's sweat, because the court of Queen Margaret of Anjou doesn't hand out silk robes to bystanders. It hands out orders, shouts, blood, and if rumours are to be believed, something a little spicier than battlefield strategy behind closed doors. The year is 1455, and England is cracking apart like an overcooked pie. The Wars of the Roses are in full bloom, red rose for Lancaster, white for York, and you're right in the thick of it, following the scent of smoke and the trail of a woman so feared they called her the she-wolf of France. But forget wolves. Margaret is more like a lioness, beautiful, brutal, and very good at hiding the bones of her enemies. To the public, Margaret is a queen married to Henry VI, the most passive man ever to drool on a crown. He's religious, fragile, and not exactly an alpha. Margaret, on the other hand, drips with power. She controls council meetings, she arranges alliances, and when her husband collapses into a silent stupor for over a year, Margaret doesn't cry. She starts running the country. Now, here's where things heat up. The talk isn't just about Margaret's grip on the throne, it's about her grip on certain nobles, especially Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset. Too many letters, too many long glances, too many suspicious absences when the king's tucked away in his unwell phase. People start whispering the prince, Edward of Westminster, might not be Henry's son at all, might be Somerset's. Might have been conceived during one of those conveniently unchaperoned council meetings. You trail her through the cold halls of Coventry, one of her favoured residences, and the air is thick with incense and tension. Margaret's not the type to giggle behind fans. She walks like a general, talks like a lawyer. But in private, the rumours say she had tastes that shocked even her French ladies-in-waiting. There's a scroll, half-legible, water-damaged, that hints at a circle of court women who practice certain ritualised affections. If that sounds vague, it's meant to. Think binding oaths, late-night confessions, occasional kissing. It could have been emotional bonding, or it could have been something much more physical. One witness, a minor courtier later dismissed for improper curiosity, wrote of the Queen's Red Room, where women went in angry and came out smiling, skin glowing and silence bought. It's vague enough to be fiction, or scandalous truth buried under poetic phrasing. The story that sticks hardest, though, is the one that drifts from soldier to soldier like smoke, that Margaret sometimes visited the barracks in disguise, not to spy, not to lecture, but to select young men, tall, strong, disposable. One too many accounts describe her preference for anonymity, candlelight and veils. Was it a power trip, a rebellion against her useless husband? Or was it just that Margaret wanted control over everything, right down to her pleasure? Modern scholars roll their eyes. They say this all reeks of misogyny, that powerful women always get painted as oversexed villains, and they have a point. But you can't ignore the consistency of the tales. The same details show up in England and France. Different languages, same silk cords and whispers of bruised lips and cold morning departures. At some point, coincidence starts looking a lot like cover-up. You find yourself in her personal chamber now. Stone walls, heavy curtains, a writing desk littered with quills and open letters. One is half written in Latin, the handwriting precise and aggressive. It's a note to a commander demanding more troops, and a bottle of cherry wine. Equal urgency for both. The bed is massive, not ornate, functional, a leather-bound headboard, rope fastenings. The fire's out, but the room still feels warm, charged. You feel like you shouldn't be here. But then again, nobody ever told Margaret where she should be. You try to square the two versions of her. The queen who fought battles for her son's right to rule, and the woman who may have treated the royal court like her personal chessboard. And bedroom. In one famous account during a ceasefire, she's said to have met with a Yorkist envoy in private. The result? An hour behind closed doors, followed by an agreement that mysteriously benefited her side. Coincidence, charm? Or negotiation that involved more than just words? The open scholarly debate here is brutal. One camp insists Margaret's reputation was destroyed by Yorkist propaganda, that the she-wolf label was just a smear, that there's no hard evidence of affairs or secret rituals. But the other camp argues that something deeper was happening, an alternative culture of female power, cloaked in sensuality, that male scribes refused to record properly or deliberately distorted. You walk outside into the cold English fog. The castle towers rise like dark teeth. You hear the faint clash of practice swords in the courtyard below. Margaret is out there somewhere, maybe watching, maybe laughing. You imagine her leaning over a table, drawing battle lines with one hand and sipping wine with the other, her eyes fixed on a man who doesn't know yet that he's already lost, on the field or in her bed. By the time her reign ends in tragedy, her son dead, her power shattered, Margaret has been called a villain, a seductress, a devil in silk. But she was also one of the few women in her time who dared to rule with both sword and skin, and history still can't quite handle it. You're in Naples now, and the air is heavier, saltier even, with sea breeze and secrets. The 14th century sun glints off tiled roofs and clings to your skin like honey. But inside the Castel Nuovo, everything is cooler and darker, velvet-lined corridors, sharp whispers bouncing off stone walls, and perfume so strong it smells like ambition. This is Queen Joanna Throne's world, and you've walked straight into her web. She isn't what you expect. She doesn't glide through her palace. She stalks. Her eyes move first. They scan the room before her body even turns, calculating, cat-like. She was crowned Queen of Naples at 17, young, beautiful, and already the centre of a continent's obsession. But her power isn't just regal, it's magnetic. Men orbit her like moths, and she, for the most part, seems deeply entertained by setting them on fire. There's a rumour. You hear it before you even finish climbing the spiral staircase to her private chamber. That Queen Joanna had a habit of locking lovers away in hidden rooms, secluded, silent, and entirely hers. Not forever, just until she got bored. It sounds impossible, the kind of thing jealous nobles mutter after too many goblets of sour wine, until you hear about the footman incident. According to one account, a young guard vanished after being seen entering her wing late one evening. He reappeared weeks later, pale, dazed, and entirely mute. His feet were blistered, his hands oddly manicured. The whispers say Joanna had a thing for feet, not just looking, touching, massaging, oiling, and being massaged in return, for hours. Her chambers were always stocked with exotic oils from Alexandria, and her bathing assistants weren't always court women. It would be easy to dismiss all this as gossip, if not for the fact that even her enemies couldn't stop talking about her allure. Popes wrote letters mentioning her unwomanly boldness. Ambassadors warned their kings to avoid eye contact with her, lest they forget their mission entirely. One Venetian noble said she looked as though the sea had kissed her skin and the sun had bowed to her will, which frankly sounds like a man writing under duress or spell. The core of her notoriety: the death of her husband, Prince Andrew of Hungary. They were newly married, and it was politically complicated. He wanted power, she already had it. He demanded a coronation, she refused. Then one night in 1345, he was found hanging from a window, strangled, naked. Joanna claimed innocence. Most people smirked. Her enemies screamed murder, but no one could pin it directly on her. The general consensus: someone did it for her, out of devotion, or fear, or both. Now, here's where it gets even more complicated. there's this lesser-known tidbit, one that doesn't make it into schoolbooks but survives in a few half-burned letters. A travelling cleric once wrote that Joanna kept a book of names, not just court officials or noble families, but lovers, scores of them, their professions, talents, physical quirks. It read like a blend of diary, inventory and wish list. The cleric even claimed the book had symbols next to each name, a sun for lovers she adored, a dagger for ones she used, a chain for the ones who came back even after she dismissed them. Fringe theory? Maybe, or maybe not. A locked chest was found in the ruins of one of her estates years later, filled with oils, silk bindings, and an ivory comb carved with her crest. No book, but the tone was clear. Joanna had tastes, and she had the means to indulge them privately. But was it really perversion? Or just autonomy? That's where scholars get tense. Some argue she was simply a woman claiming the kind of sexual agency men enjoyed openly. Others insist she was a manipulator, wrapping her power in velvet and vice. There's an ongoing academic fight over whether she was a feminist icon, a political monster, or a misunderstood queen whose legacy was rewritten by the men she outlived. You're walking her private gardens now. They're overgrown, but still beautiful. There's a fountain where she reportedly held midnight gatherings, candlelit, perfumed, and masked. Only select courtiers were invited, and what happened beneath the ivy-covered trellises, that's lost to time, or locked in the silence of the mute footman. You pause near a bench carved with strange symbols, maybe astrological, maybe personal. You can imagine her here, lounging with wine in one hand, a letter from a bishop in the other, a half-naked poet at her feet reciting lines he barely wrote. She listens, then sends him away, or keeps him, depending on her mood. Joanna's downfall is as dramatic as her life. She gets caught in the whirlpool of papal politics, civil war and betrayal. Ultimately, she's suffocated in her own bedchamber by a cousin who wants her throne. No trials, no farewells, just silence. But you can't shake the feeling that she planned for this. That somewhere in the dark corners of her palace, her secrets are still tucked away. That maybe, just maybe, she knew history would never be able to tell her story straight. And maybe that was the plan all along. Because when you leave the palace, the stone corridor behind you smells faintly of rose oil and damp leather, and for the briefest moment, you think you hear the click of a lock sliding shut. The air shifts again, thinner now, drier, almost like parchment. You're not in the warm shadows of Naples anymore. You're somewhere colder, sharper. Welcome to Sweden in the 17th century. The sky's pale and grey, the buildings stiff with Protestant severity, and the court is cloaked in Lutheran restraint. But that's just surface tension. Beneath it, a queen so strange, so unapologetically herself, the very idea of royal decorum splits at the seams. You're about to meet Christina of Sweden, who ruled, wrote, rebelled, and very possibly tied people up for fun. Christina doesn't walk like a queen. She strides like a philosopher. She rarely wears gowns, preferring tailored coats, boots, and the occasional sword. Her hair is cropped short. Her voice carries. And her bedroom? Let's just say it's not listed in your standard royal tour. The Swedish court never quite knows what to do with her. Half the time, they're mesmerised. The other half, they're frantically rewriting etiquette manuals. By the time she's crowned at 18, Christina is already a whirlwind. She reads everything, debates everyone, sleeps very little, and develops deep, obsessive attachments to certain women in her inner circle, particularly one Ebba Sparre. You hear her name over and over in the Queen's letters. Christina calls her Belle, writes poems about her skin, and even demands she sleep in her bedchamber when travelling. Friends? Sure. Besties. Okay, but the phrases bosom pressed to mine and I die when she leaves feel layered. Court gossip at the time is absolutely electric. They lie together like man and wife, one diplomat writes in a letter to his king. Another courtier mutters about unnatural embraces and moans at night. Now, none of this gets put into official history books, of course, but you're standing in the very hallways where it all happened, and the walls practically radiate tension. Here's the quirkier bit. Christina's taste in sensuality isn't just about intimacy, it's theatrical. She once commissioned a private performance in which women dressed as knights, competed in jousting, and ended the night by wrestling in silk robes soaked with scented oil. guests were encouraged to observe silently from curtained alcoves. One chronicler called it a chivalric ballet of the senses, another just called it sin in pageant form. And yet, Christina was also deeply intellectual, obsessed with art, philosophy and mysticism. She invited Descartes to her court. He died shortly after arriving, possibly from the cold in the schedule. She collected relics, rare manuscripts and paintings, many of which were, how shall we put this, explicit. She once wrote in a journal that the nude form reveals the divine through desire. So yeah, she was reading Plato and stroking marble thighs in the same afternoon. There's a famously debated letter, tattered, water-stained and unsigned, believed to be from Christina to one of her lovers. It describes a night spent bound not by law, but by satin, by breath, by heat. Most historians shrug, a few squirm, but the fringe group? They argue that Christina kept a locked trunk beneath her bed, filled with cords, masks and pages of handwritten instructions. Erotic, possibly. Political, always. What's not up for debate is her total disinterest in marrying. She's pushed, pressured, even bribed with titles and lands. Her answer is always a variation of absolutely not. Eventually she stuns all of Europe by abdicating the throne entirely. Just walks away. At age 27, she gives up everything. Crown, country, court. For what? Freedom? A life without royal restraints? Possibly. Or possibly for a chance to explore her pleasures and philosophies without an audience. She moves to Rome, converts to Catholicism, which should be the end of her story. But no. Christina builds an eccentric court there, full of artists, misfits, and people you wouldn't let near a royal event in Sweden. She's buried in St. Peter's Basilica, a rare honour for a woman, rarer still for one with her legacy. The Vatican tries to reframe her life as a journey of spiritual triumph. You glance around her Roman quarters and see a different narrative. Velvet divans, paintings of mythological lovers in compromising positions, and a certain silver-bound journal filled with Latin quotes about ecstasy and the soul. Now, the scholarly debate surrounding Christina is spicy. Some insist she was asexual, preferring companionship and intellect to physical intimacy. Others point to her passionate letters and her unconventional tastes as clear evidence of queerness, perhaps pansexual, perhaps fluid before anyone had a word for it. The more fringe voices claim she was secretly into BDSM, and the proof? A fragment of her diary with the Latin phrase dolore per ardorem, pain through passion. Whatever the truth, you're left standing in her private chamber, hand hovering over a writing desk worn smooth at the corners. There's a single rose in a glass, dried, delicate, and next to it, an ivory comb carved with a pair of doves, intertwined at the beak, wings half folded, as if mid-flight. You can almost hear her voice behind you, low and amused. You think I was strange, but I was free. And maybe that's the real scandal, not the rumoured lovers, or the costumes or the nights behind closed doors, but the simple fact that Christina lived on her own terms, touched what she wanted, ruled like a man, loved like a mystery, and died with no apologies. You walk out into the Swedish air again, colder now, cleaner. But something lingers, a spark, a smirk. A queen who didn't care if history misunderstood her, as long as it remembered. You're in England again, only now it's the glittering paranoid court of Queen Elizabeth I the year, somewhere in the late 1500s. The exact date doesn't matter. Time bends in this place, especially when you're surrounded by crushed velvet, ghostly candlelight, and courtiers who smile too much. You walk the halls of Whitehall Palace, where the walls seem to listen and the air smells like beeswax, rosewater, and ambition. You're here for the Virgin Queen, the woman who never married, never had children, and never let anyone forget it. But as you step closer, the virgin part, it starts to look a little negotiable. Elizabeth sits on the throne wrapped in gold embroidery and sheer menace. Her face is powdered white, a fragile porcelain mask hiding a brain that slices through Parliament like a dagger through silk. But behind the divine image, behind all the Gloriana myth and never-ending portraits of her holding roses or orbs, you find the court of a woman surrounded by exceptionally handsome men, and more than a few very suspiciously private rooms. They call them favourites, gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, Knights of the Bedchamber, Master of the Horse. And no, that's not a euphemism, although it easily could be. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was the first and most prominent. Childhood friend, lifelong companion, keeper of secrets, and maybe, probably the man she loved. Whether she did more than love him, though, that's where the historians get fidgety. You overhear gossip in the gallery. Elizabeth had Dudley's rooms moved directly beneath her own, the passage between them, locked only from her side. Servants reported muffled voices at all hours. One, particularly dramatic, described hearing a single cry of delight followed by soft weeping. That could mean anything, of course. But it doesn't stop the imagination from sprinting. Then there's the bedchamber choreography. Elizabeth kept men around her all the time, brushing her hair, bringing her food, adjusting her gowns. There are court records detailing how many of her virgins were dismissed for getting too friendly with the favourites. One woman was found sobbing outside Dudley's quarters, claiming Elizabeth took everything. It sounds like political heartbreak. It could also be a love triangle no one was brave enough to name out loud. Quirk alert. Elizabeth reportedly had a thing for tickling. Like, a full-blown, documented thing. It started as innocent play, an odd habit of teasing courtiers during conversations, fingers suddenly darting to ribs or necks. But it escalated. There's one letter from a visiting French ambassador, horrified but intrigued, describing a moment where Elizabeth pinned a nobleman against a column, tickled him until he gasped, then calmly resumed her conversation about naval funding. Was it flirtation? Dominance? A stress outlet? Who knows? But it became enough of a pattern that people wrote it down. And let's not skip over her court's endless masquerades. She loved them. They went on for hours, some all night. Elaborate themes, mythical costumes, men dressed as gods, women as nymphs, everyone swirling through candlelit halls, identities blurred, and Elizabeth was always at the centre, sometimes veiled, sometimes not. One of her favourite disguises, a Roman goddess known for seduction. Coincidence? Doubtful. The scholarly debate here is basically a royal tug-of-war. Some argue that Elizabeth's virginity was a political tool, a brilliant branding choice that kept her untouchable and sovereign. Others say it was more personal, that she had genuine trauma from her mother Anne Boleyn's execution and distrusted physical intimacy. But the third camp, the one with wine-stained notebooks and sceptical grins, thinks the truth lies somewhere steamier. That Elizabeth did take lovers, quietly, carefully, never to pregnancy, never to scandal, just far enough to keep her craving power, but close enough to remind herself, and others, that she was still very much alive, that her throne didn't freeze her body, it sharpened it. You wander into her private apartments now. They've been scrubbed of scent and scandal, but something lingers. The way the chairs are angled, the softness of the light. There's a mirror cracked just slightly at the top, like someone once hurled something across the room. A lute sits in the corner, one string missing. On the writing desk, a scrap of poetry in her hand, half finished. He loves me not in truth, but in disguise, and I in fire cloak frost behind my eyes. Chilling, and weirdly hot. And then there's the final act. Elizabeth died alone, or so they say. But fringe stories, mostly found in diaries and letters never meant for public eyes, speak of a figure who left her room the morning she died. A tall man, cloaked, face hidden, not a physician, not a priest, just someone. No name, no explanation. So maybe she kept her vow. Maybe she really was the Virgin Queen, but maybe she just redefined what virgin meant. Maybe she gave herself everything except a wedding ring. And maybe that was her real kink, denying the world the thing it wanted most from her. You step back out into the chill of the English morning. The stone beneath your feet is worn smooth from centuries of curiosity, but the legend still holds, not because we believe she never loved, but because we can't decide how far she let it go. Now the desert opens up before you, red sands, broken columns, and the ruins of a queen who might have been forgotten if she hadn't left such a delicious trail of resistance, conquest, and barely subtle seduction. You're in Palmyra, Syria, 3rd century. The heat clings to you like silk, and everything smells like dust, spiced wine, and sun-baked stone. The woman you've come to meet is Queen Zenobia, and if you think Cleopatra was the only queen to weaponize her body and mind, think again. Zenobia read that playbook, and rewrote it with armour on. She arrives on horseback, of course, black stallion, gold breastplate, veil fluttering behind her like a war banner. The soldiers cheer her not out of politeness, but loyalty, devotion even. She fought beside them, ate with them, and occasionally, depending on who's telling the story, invited her favourites to stay behind while the camp slept. Zenobia's power comes from her boldness. After her husband, the ruler of Palmyra, was assassinated, she didn't just take the reins of government, she went full empire mode. She expanded into Egypt, challenged Rome, and declared her son Emperor of the East. But here's where it gets personal. Her rise wasn't just strategic, it was irresistible. She knew how to hold an audience with beauty, yes, but also intellect. She spoke multiple languages, wrote poetry, quoted Homer, and possibly made Roman envoys sweat through their togas. A Roman historian named Aurelian, not exactly a fan, describes her as chaste and dignified, which is ancient Latin for too smart and scary to seduce. But not everyone agreed. There are letters, shaky translations admittedly, that describe her tent as a place of both strategy and instruction. One Roman prisoner, later released in exchange for gold and spices, told of being questioned by the queen for several hours. He never said what kind of questions. But he did say she used scented oil on his wrists when binding him to the tent pole. You blink. Maybe that's metaphor. Maybe not. Now here's a lesser-known quirk. Zenobia was obsessed with ancient Egyptian culture. She styled herself after Cleopatra, wore similar robes, used Egyptian incense and surrounded herself with dancers trained in Nile rituals. One particularly fringe theory, that she staged reenactments of Cleopatra's seduction scenes for favoured guests, some say as performance, others say as participation. You weren't there, obviously, but the logistics of a reenacted barge ride with honeyed figs and whispered Latin poetry definitely raises some eyebrows. Her court, though militaristic, was anything but austere. Marble floors, rose gardens, musicians, philosophers. But unlike Roman courts where sensuality was whispered behind closed doors, Zenobia made hers part of the architecture. Statues of lovers, male, female, ambiguous, adorned her palace halls. The frescoes in her private bathhouse, still partially visible today. You make out two women reclining on a couch, one holding a goblet, the other. You squint. Okay, that's not a foot massage. So was Zenobia just Cleopatra 2.0? Scholars can't agree. Some say she borrowed heavily from her North African predecessor, right down to the seductive politics. Others argue she was her own brand of rebel queen, sharper, less theatrical, more dangerous because of her restraint. She didn't flaunt scandal. She hinted at it, invited it like a card game, let everyone draw their own conclusions. You walk now through what remains of her audience hall. The columns are cracked, open to the sky, but you can still feel the pressure of what this space once meant. A throne at the far end, once inlaid with lapis, carpet soft enough to make guests sink when they knelt, and off to the side, a small alcove hidden by a broken arch. That's where it gets interesting. Some excavation notes, mostly overlooked, mention finding anklets and carved ivory pins near that spot. Personal items, not religious. One pin had the shape of a snake swallowing its tail. Another, a fig leaf. Were they offerings, or accessories left behind after a night that turned into mourning? Hard to say, but your brain fills in the blanks faster than you'd like. Her end is less glorious, captured by the Romans, brought to Aurelian in chains. But even then the stories twist. One account says she was paraded through Rome, shamed publicly. Another says she married a Roman senator and lived out her days in luxury, surrounded by books, lovers, and the kind of conversations that ended with flushed cheeks and slow exits. Which version is true? Depends on which scroll you trust. Some historians believe she negotiated her survival through charm, diplomacy, and a veiled threat or two. Others think she never surrendered at all, just played a different kind of game until Rome got bored of her. One particularly spicy theory, that Zenobia was given a villa in Tivoli and hosted salons for Roman elites, slowly turning them against their own emperor, a kind of slow seduction of politics. No whips, no chains, just wine, philosophy, and the slow erosion of resistance. The deadliest weapon in her arsenal was her patience. You sit on the warm stone now, the sky dimming above the ruins. The air smells like dust and something sweeter, like dried figs and sandalwood. Maybe it's your imagination, or maybe this place remembers her. Zenobia's not just a name in a history book. She's the whisper in a Roman general's ear, the faint scent of oil in a desert tent, the queen who kissed back when the world tried to silence her. And tonight, she kissed you too. A little. Spain this time. The 13th century. You arrive at dusk and the sky is dipped in orange and wine. The palace is white stone, soft with age, and though the exterior looks pious, arches carved with prayers, gardens trimmed into crosses, you can already feel the hum of something else underneath. Something warmer. Stranger. You're in the heart of a court where queens whisper in ancient tongues and conduct quiet gatherings lit only by candles, and at the centre, a woman whose name has been carefully polished out of the history books. Except for one title that keeps resurfacing like a floating pearl, the High Sister. They don't call it a cult. That's not the word anyone dares to use. But the women of Queen Violent of Aragon's circle were definitely not spending their nights spinning wool and praying for their husband's safe return. You're ushered into the upper level of a private hall where the ceilings are frescoed with constellations, and a breeze smells faintly of myrrh and something more herbal. Beneath you, robed women walk in slow circles, hands clasped, eyes closed, mouths moving in unison, not praying, chanting, not Latin, not Arabic, something in between. Queen Violent, wife of James IV of Aragon, a king known for his military conquests and deep sighs of exhaustion, whenever she entered a room, was no ordinary consort. Educated, devout in public, and absolutely maddening in private, she was said to be the architect of what courtiers called la sombra femenina, the female shadow. A network of noblewomen, nuns and secret courtiers who met regularly in hidden chapels and old Moorish baths, where they discussed philosophy, body, pleasure, and the inconvenient position of being smarter than the men who ruled them. One chronicler, clearly scandalized, described these sessions as spiritual gatherings laced with carnal misdirection. That's one way to phrase a midnight meeting where naked women bathe together under coloured lanterns while discussing St. Teresa's visions. Another word? Empowerment. Maybe enlightenment. Or, depending on your level of discomfort, something bordering on erotic mysticism. There's one woman in the records, Lady Inez de Luna, who wrote down, in the margins of a devotional book, that the Queen believed physical touch between women was a mirror of divine connection. That alone would have been enough to earn a heresy trial. Except Inez didn't get arrested. She got promoted to head of Queen Violent's ladies-in-waiting, which, again, could be innocent. Or not. You wander through the Queen's private quarters now and everything feels soft. No stone, no sharp corners, just silks, cushions, a dressing table carved with astrological signs. A rosewood box sits open beside the bed. Inside, a small vial of oil, dried rose petals, and what looks suspiciously like a braided leather loop. Decorative, surely. Just very conveniently shaped. Here's the thing about Violent. She knew the power of plausible deniability. She commissioned religious texts, sponsored convents, had a confessor who was more terrified of her than he was of sin. But she also kept a guest list, a rotating cycle of women from across the kingdom, some married, some widowed, all of whom arrived with guarded smiles and left with flushed cheeks. The Queen claimed these were spiritual retreats. Others whispered a different name, La Luna Callada, the Silent Moon. According to a fringe document written by a dismissed scribe, these gatherings often involved shared meals, incense massages, and long reflections, where women touched each other's bodies as symbols of divine form. You're told this was symbolic. Then again, so are a lot of things in religious history: incense, wine, bread, the phrase gentle blessings of the night. That doesn't mean they're not also physical. There's a particular poem tucked into the margins of an Aragonese hymnal, attributed to the Queen herself. It reads, "She kissed me once, not in sin but in light, and I saw heaven not above but in her eyes. It's unsigned, but written in the Queen's exact hand." So, historians are split on all this. Some claim it was simply emotional intimacy between isolated women in a patriarchal society. Others say Violent's gatherings were an intentional if discreet expression of sapphic culture, a subversive current flowing quietly through Catholic Spain long before anyone dared speak of such things. And then there's the ritual theory crowd. Fringe academics who suggest the Queen was reviving older, pre-Christian rites woven into these moonlit sessions. They point to the incense blends, the stone altars, the circular baths and moon-based calendar. They get laughed at by mainstream scholars, but even so, no one can explain where the Queen acquired certain Eastern texts found in her library, or why she had a copy of Sappho's fragments bound in gold leaf and hidden beneath her psalter. As night fully falls, you step into the garden behind her chambers. The moon hangs low, the air is still. Somewhere, music plays. Slow, stringed, melancholic. You see a figure pass between two archways. A woman in silver robes, face unreadable. She doesn't speak, just looks at you for a moment, long enough for your heart to stutter, and disappears. Maybe it was your imagination. Maybe it was the High Sister herself. Maybe they're still here in a way, these women of silk and shadow, who whispered prayers and pleasures into the same air, unwilling to choose between holiness and hunger. You leave the garden feeling changed, not by what you saw, but by what you almost did. And somewhere behind you, a door shuts softly. You arrive at dusk, again, because it's always dusk when the past starts pulling at your collar. This time, it's the crumbling coast of Brittany, and the sea is churning against dark cliffs, like it's trying to swallow the memory of what happened here. But it can't, because Queen Anne of Brittany left a mark deeper than the salt spray on stone, etched not just into treaties and thrones, but into a long-forgotten seasonal ritual that blurs the line between fertility, superstition, and something you're not entirely sure you're comfortable with. Anne was twice Queen of France, married first to Charles VIII, then to Louis IV. But before she was either of those, she was Duchess of Brittany. And Brittany, let's just say, had its own rhythm. Ancient, stubborn, a region where Roman gods once whispered under church altars, and pagan practices lingered like the smell of burning herbs in country chapels. That's the backdrop. And Anne? She was both ruler and relic keeper. Now, you've read the official court accounts. They say she was devout, dutiful, and deeply invested in preserving Brittany's autonomy. Sure, but they don't tell you about the 12 nights, a local custom Anne reportedly revived and adapted for her own purposes. It begins at the winter solstice, each night for 12 nights, a feast. Each feast, a theme. Abundance, harvest, warmth, desire. Anne hosted these not in Paris, but back in Brittany, in her ancestral halls. The guest list was highly selective. Mostly women, sometimes travelling musicians, sometimes monks, although the monks never lasted more than one night. You walk through the stone corridor leading to the feast hall, and you feel the air thicken, not from dust, from memory. The hall itself is long and low-ceilinged, lit by what must have been hundreds of beeswax candles, their smoke once curling into patterns on the ceiling, the only surviving decor. Carvings of vines, fruit, breasts. Yes, breasts. Small, delicate. Tucked into the design like some kind of naughty joke no one's admitting to. You run your fingers over one and find it oddly warm. Historical records mention the feasts only briefly, usually in dismissive tones, seasonal entertainments, rustic diversions. But one foreign ambassador wrote home in disbelief, describing a scene where women in sheer gowns danced barefoot around a bonfire indoors, while Anne, in a red cloak, poured honeyed wine into their mouths and whispered prayers that definitely weren't in Latin. You get more curious, dig deeper. That's when you find the priest's letter, hidden in a collection of Breton folk tales, unsigned but filled with scathing detail. He claimed that Anne presided over a night of breeding, where couples were paired by the throwing of lots, and the Queen herself determined who should share beds, and who should fast in solitude. He called it Le Jeu d'Hiver, the winter game. The letter's tone is one of outrage, but also reluctant fascination. He describes body oils with strange herbs, symbols painted on bellies, and a peculiar practice of breath-sharing, which you're sure is just fancy 15th century speak for kissing that went on too long to be ecclesiastically acceptable. Now, were these just folk traditions she preserved? Innocent rustic rituals in silk and perfume? Maybe. But one scholar argues that Anne's version had layers of political strategy, specifically arranged trysts between key families under the guise of chance, binding alliances through passion before contracts were ever drawn. Another, less popular but infinitely more fun, suggests the rituals weren't about politics at all. that Anne simply enjoyed creating a world, however briefly, where women chose, touched, tasted, and ruled. A private queendom lit by firelight and charged with secrets. Here's the quirky bit. One journal from Anne's hand, barely legible now, mentions a favourite companion of hers during these nights, a lady-in-waiting named Isabeau. The entry reads, "She wore the mist like silk. Her eyes held the dusk. I would crown her queen of every hour if I could." No further context, but the phrasing doesn't exactly sound administrative. Historians love to debate Anne's real character. Was she the shrewd politician, always grieving the independence of Brittany? The obedient wife masking power beneath piety, or something else entirely? One chronicler described her as chaste in public, wild in her roots. He might have meant it metaphorically, but if you've spent even 5 minutes in the 12 Nights corridor, you know better. You pause in the hallway outside what used to be her personal bath chamber. The door is missing, but the outline of it remains, along with a faint mural. A woman with flowing hair surrounded by animals. You recognise Artemis, but the Breton caption beneath her says, La Reine des Lunes, the Queen of Moons. It's all starting to come together. These weren't just parties, they were rebirths. A space where women escaped courtly duty, where the old gods danced in the firelight one last time, and where Anne, twice a queen, always a duchess, wasn't anyone's consort. She was priestess, conductor, seductress, and she made the rules. No one talks about the 12 Nights anymore. The rituals vanished under layers of Catholicism and French nationalism, but you swear as you step into the cold courtyard that the ground still remembers, that something under your feet stirs when you speak her name aloud. Anne! It feels heavier than it should, and somewhere, far off, a single candle flickers in a window that's supposed to be empty. It's dark this time, midnight probably, and you're not sure how you got here. 1 minute, you are retracing Anne's footsteps through candlelit corridors, and the next, you're in Castile. Thick stone walls, colder air, and an ominous silence that suggests you're not just in a palace, you're in a vault of secrets. The torches along the hallway burn low, the guards don't speak, and everything smells faintly of iron and rosewood. This is Queen Blanche of Castile's world now, and you're about to learn why chastity isn't always what it seems. Blanche, as far as the official records go, is the poster child of piety. Born into royalty, married to the French crown, mother to Louis the Nin, St. Louis no less. She ruled France as regent while he crusaded, and nearly died in foreign deserts. She's remembered as devout, intelligent, incorruptible. She also, however, had an unsettling obsession with control, over her court, over her son, over herself, and that obsession, it left behind more than just legal reforms and a perfectly preserved reputation. There's a legend, whispered in the back corridors of royal convents, that Blanche wore a chastity belt. Not a symbolic one, not some metaphor for political purity, but an actual custom-forged contraption, studded with pearls, lined with silk, locked. The key was said to hang around her neck during the day and vanish at night. It sounds like satire, or some medieval moralist bad fan fiction, but then you find the sketch, half faded, tucked into a treatise on queenship from the 1300s, a belt of iron and ivory, engraved with lilies, with a strange inscription near the clasp, "Only my will shall grant passage." Most historians brush it off, but a few, the ones who don't get invited to conferences, suggest it wasn't just symbolic, that Blanche used it to intimidate suitors, clergy, maybe even herself, that it was less about abstinence and more about authority, or kink. A kind of medieval power statement no one dared question. You walk her private chambers now, and they're unnervingly quiet. No soft tapestries or perfumed cushions here, just cold floors, a prayer kneeler worn down by decades, and a single polished mirror that reflects your face with uncomfortable clarity. Blanche watched herself often, they say, for flaws, for strength, for discipline. There's even a record of her instructing her maids to report changes in her skin, her weight, even her scent. A queen should know her body, she once wrote. The phrasing feels sterile, but underneath it, a whisper of intimacy. Almost possessive. And then there's the pearl tradition. It starts innocent enough. Blanche was fond of pearls. She wore them often, but the deeper you dig, the stranger it gets. She gifted pearls not just to her courtiers, but to select novices at certain convents. Always single pearls, always hand-delivered, always accompanied by whispered instructions. A curious letter between two abbesses, still preserved, mentions Her Majesty's pearls of silence, and warns that wearing them outside the cloister was considered inappropriate. You start to wonder what exactly was going on behind convent walls under royal blessing. A former maid, dismissed for dishonesty of spirit, later claimed Blanche held private cleansing sessions with selected women, usually widows or unmarried noble ladies, where they would sit naked in a hot stone room and be anointed with milk and prayer. It's all very vague and maybe even innocent until you get to the line about Blanche reciting psalms directly into the navel of each woman. Yes, the navel. You pause, reread it, and wish you hadn't. But here's where the open scholarly debate rages. Was Blanche genuinely holy? Did she simply embody an era that demanded female rulers mask every breath of sensuality in layers of devotion? Or was she playing a different game? One where chastity was the fetish, denial the pleasure, control the aphrodisiac? Some argue she weaponized purity to shame rivals and silence scandal. Others believe she was genuinely obsessed with religious perfection. And then there's the fringe view, whispered in academic footnotes, that Blanche saw her body as a temple not for God but for power, that every fast, every silence, every rejection was her way of staying in control, not just of others, but of herself. You find yourself back at the mirror. It's clearer now, weirdly, and you swear the reflection is different, just slightly off, as if someone else is in the room, not behind you, inside the glass, watching, measuring, waiting to decide whether you're worthy of what comes next. And that's when you see it, the trunk at the base of her bed, not locked, not decorated, just a simple cedar box worn smooth. You lift the lid. Inside, a single belt. No pearls, no silk, just iron, cold, clean, uncompromising. There's a note beneath it, barely legible. To command the flesh is to possess the throne. No signature, just that. You close the trunk carefully. When Blanche died, they said she passed peacefully, surrounded by nuns, her son at her side, her hands folded neatly across her chest. But some swore they saw a faint smile on her lips. Not joy, not holiness, just satisfaction. You step out into the courtyard. The sky above Castile is velvet black. Somewhere nearby a bell tolls softly. You wonder for a moment what it would have been like to stand before her, this queen of silence, of iron, of hidden rituals and locked desires, and ask, was it all real? And you already know the answer. She would have looked at you once and said nothing. Now you're in Paris and it's all shadowed towers, narrow streets, and that particular kind of damp that feels like it's crawling under your skin with purpose. The year is 1314, and the House of Capet is teetering, the crown still glittering, but the people are gossiping like rats in a pantry, and you've just stumbled into one of the most scandalous, tangled, and fatal royal affairs ever to shake medieval France. It's called the Tour de Nesle affair, and if that sounds like a sexy bedtime story turned political horror show, well, congratulations, you're exactly right. The cast? 3 daughters-in-law of King Philip IV, Margaret of Burgundy, Blanche of Burgundy, and Joan of Navarre. The crime, alleged adultery. The setting, a tower on the Seine River, the Tour de Nesle, a looming old relic that everyone swears is haunted, not by ghosts but by reputation. It starts with Princess Isabella of France. Yes, that Isabella who later invades England and helps murder her husband, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. While visiting her father in Paris, she notices that her brother's wives seem unusually cosy with 2 handsome young knights, the D'Aulnay brothers. Their hair is long, their manners are bold, and their belts are often, shall we say, improperly fastened. Isabella reports her suspicions to King Philip, who does what any reasonable medieval monarch would do when told his royal family is being turned into a bedroom comedy. He launches a full-scale investigation. What follows is straight-up tabloid fodder, except it's real and ends in blood. The knights are arrested, tortured, confess. Margaret and Blanche are imprisoned. Joan is implicated but protected. The most salacious detail, that Margaret and Blanche held trysts in the Tour de Nesle, a riverside tower conveniently empty after dark, where the brothers would sneak in through tunnels, sometimes dressed as monks, and leave at dawn wearing each other's cloaks to confuse the guards. There's one surviving account from a servant who claimed to have found silk stockings, wine cups, and the unmistakable scent of musk and roses in the tower's top room. That's oddly specific. Also, very suspicious. Now here's the kicker. No one's quite sure how much of this was true. Were they actually lovers? Were the accusations fabricated by political enemies? Was Isabella acting out of righteous disgust or naked ambition? Scholars are still fighting about it. Some believe the affair was exaggerated, a convenient excuse to remove women from political power. Others point to the tortured confessions and say, come on, something definitely happened. But there's a fringe theory that kicks it all into another realm. According to one obscure chronicle, discredited by most, but undeniably juicy, the Tour de Nesle wasn't just a meeting spot, it was a staging ground, a game, the Queen's Dare, as it was called in secret. The rules: one of the princesses would issue a challenge, seduce a courtier, steal an item from the king's chamber, or perform an act of pleasure without sound. The knights were willing players. Rewards included silk favours, jewelled tokens, and, in at least one case, a lock of hair braided with a pearl. Now this sounds like pure scandal fantasy. Except for one problem. An inventory list from the tower, accidentally preserved in a tax scroll, mentions an unusually high number of cushions, perfumed linens, and 4 Venetian masks. All acquired on behalf of the royal daughters. 4 masks, 3 princesses, 1 knight, or 1 guest. Here's where it gets darker. After the arrests, Margaret is sentenced to imprisonment. Her husband, the future Louis XI, refuses to speak to her again. She's locked away in the Château Gaillard, in a damp tower that makes the Tour de Nesle look like a spa. She dies less than 2 years later. Official cause: cold air and weakened spirit. Unofficial rumour: she was strangled, possibly with her own hair. Blanche gets a similar fate: monastic confinement. Joan, as the queen of the future King Philip V, escapes punishment entirely, despite being just as entangled. The commoners, unsurprisingly, eat it up. Suddenly the royal family isn't divine, they're flesh, flawed, and capable of midnight games with fatal consequences. And here's the strangest, quirkiest fact. The tower itself, Tour de Nesle, was later used to house theological scholars, monks, clerics. There's a lovely irony there. A place of whispered moans and silk-cloaked secrets turned into a sanctuary of celibacy and scripture. You walk its perimeter now, and you swear the stone is warmer than it should be, like it remembers everything. As you climb the spiral stairs, the air grows tight. There's a draught at the top, and you're standing in the very room where Margaret may have leaned out the window, listening for the slap of boots on wet cobblestone. The room is empty, except for a single carving barely visible behind a loose brick. A rose, crude, rough-edged, but unmistakable, the symbol of secrecy, or defiance, or both. The Tour de Nesle affair left its stain. The Capetian dynasty never fully recovered. And it taught every future queen a lesson that went far beyond passion or betrayal. They are always watching, and they will always believe the worst. Still, you can't help but imagine the laughter that once echoed here, the thrill, the silk whispering over skin, the feeling of being untouchable, just for one night. You close the window slowly. Down below the Seine still flows, and so do the stories. You wake to birdsong and something even softer, the sound of sheer curtains brushing against stone. The sun is already high, but it filters through stained glass, painting the room in gold and deep blue. You're not in Paris or Castile anymore. You're in Georgia. Not the American one, but the medieval kingdom nestled between the Black Sea and the Caucasus Mountains. A crossroads of trade, war, and poetry. And this morning you're in the court of Queen Tamar, the woman they called King Tamar because Queen apparently wasn't a big enough title for what she became. She was bold, brilliant, and in the quietest of rumours, deeply, peculiarly private. The court at Tbilisi is grand, but in a way that's distinctly un-European. Here, domes rise instead of towers. Floors are inlaid with swirling mosaics instead of stern stone slabs. There are no crucifixes nailed to every wall. Instead, there are icons with shimmering eyes and red cheeks. Saints who look like they know more than they're telling. Tamar sits beneath one of them now, in a throne with gold embroidery, her hair pulled back into a braid so long it drapes over one shoulder like a rope. She is watching, always watching. You're told she married twice, first to a drunken Russian prince who insulted her in public and mysteriously disappeared into exile, and then to a nobleman of her own choosing. But if you ask the court poets, the real ones, the ones who read between the lines, they'll say neither man was her true consort, that Tamar's most intense attachments were with her inner circle of noblewomen, ladies who shared her chambers, travelled with her, slept in tents beside her on military campaigns. One name rises again and again, Rusudan. Rusudan of the Bagrationi family, Tamar's cousin, confidant, and, depending on which dusty volume you find tucked into an old monastery archive, something much more intimate. A 13th century hymn written in Tamar's honour includes a line translated loosely as, "She slept wrapped in virtue and in soft breath, heart to heart with the moon's reflection." A strange phrase. But a few pages later the same hymn references Rusudan's absence in a stanza that reads more like longing than praise. You're not a linguist, but you know a breakup ballad when you hear one. Now, here's where things get odd. Very little direct scandal surrounds Tamar. That's not because she was scandal-free. It's because her reign was so successful, no one dared record anything negative. She doubled the size of the kingdom, defeated invading armies, patronised monasteries and poets. And yet, in the corners of her reputation, the whispers curl, about her midnight rituals, her odd requirement that her bedchamber be entered only after 3 knocks and 1 breath held, the presence of incense, not Christian but Eastern, imported from Persia, burning constantly in her private rooms. There's one account written by an Italian merchant who spent a winter at court that claims Tamar held moonlight suppers for a very select group of women, feasts with no music, no men, no servants, just platters of honey-drenched fruit, spiced wine, and a central brazier over which they would place hands, reciting verses from Georgian epics. The merchant wrote, "I heard only laughter at first, then silence so complete I feared the room had vanished." Whatever happened at those suppers he never found out. Or maybe he did, and chose not to write it down. One quirky detail? Tamar reportedly wore rings on her toes, not just for decoration but as warding charms. Some say they were enchanted, others say they were given to her by lovers as tokens. One particularly intriguing story claims that when a certain lady-in-waiting left the court unexpectedly, Tamar was seen limping the next morning. Draw your own conclusions. You walk the gardens now, lavender and olive trees, the air thick with bees and secrets. A stone bench bears a carved inscription. Love hides in shadow and shines in truth. The letters are faded but unmistakably royal, Tamar's handwriting. You know it from her surviving letters, one of which, oddly enough, is addressed to the half of my soul, whom no priest shall name. The name was scratched out centuries ago. But the burn marks on the paper suggest that whoever tried to destroy it couldn't quite bring themselves to finish the job. This is where the scholars split. The mainstream historians argue that Tamar was chaste, devoted to her people, and above mortal desire. That the emotional closeness between women was common for the time, and any suggestion of romance is a modern projection. But then there are the fringe academics, the ones who point to the incense, the rings, the verses, the sudden disappearances of certain ladies from court without explanation, and ask, why are we so afraid of admitting that a queen might have had desire? You pause at a small chapel on the edge of the palace grounds. The candles are still lit, though no one seems to be around. There's a painting on the wall, not of Christ or Mary, but of a veiled woman holding a sword in one hand and a rose in the other. Her eyes look just like Tamar's, and beneath it, carved in old Georgian script, "She who ruled the night need not confess." You step outside. The breeze rises. The shadows lengthen. Tamar's world was made of victories, yes, but also velvet and veils, glances too long to be accidental, and doors that closed without explanation. She was the king, the queen, the high priestess of her own myth, and whatever she did in the silence of her chambers, she never had to answer for it. Not then. Not now. Maybe not ever. You're deep in the northern Italian countryside now, surrounded by rolling hills, fortified abbeys, and the kind of heavy fog that seems to press secrets into the soil. It's sometime in the 11th century. and you're on your way to Canossa, a castle that sits like a clenched fist at the edge of the Apennines. Inside waits Matilda of Tuscany, warrior countess, papal enforcer, and, depending on who's doing the whispering, the most sexually ambiguous political figure in medieval Christendom. She's armoured, crowned, and allegedly tied quite a few knots that weren't exactly political. From the outside, Matilda's life reads like a saint's, and a warlord's had a very confusing baby. She was one of the most powerful women of her time, controlling vast swaths of land from Lombardy to Lazio, leading troops into battle, and serving as a key supporter of the Pope during the investiture controversy. But that's not why the tension in the air around her old castle could slice cheese. It's because the line between her political power and personal preferences was always blurred, and probably on purpose. You walk through the lower halls first, passing suits of armour, stained glass, and dusty frescoes of lions, saints, and oddly enough, a naked Venus tucked discreetly in a chapel corner. Then you arrive at her private study, still intact, stone desk, wax seal stamps, and piles of half-translated theological scrolls. She was fluent in Latin, of course. She had to be. But her favourite letters, the ones written in her own hand, weren't always addressed to popes or generals. They were to women, nuns, noblewomen, widows, with phrases like, "Your voice lingers in my chambers," and "I wait for your scent in the evening light." Nobody wrote about these in her official biographies. There's a letter, mostly ignored by scholars, that was found in a forgotten part of a monastic archive. It's unsigned, but the penmanship matches Matilda's surviving correspondence. It describes an oath of velvet and steel, an embrace pressed against cold walls, and a bond not witnessed by priest, but by moonlight. The recipient, unknown. The tone, intimate, fierce. Not exactly what you'd expect from a papal war hero. Here's where things get especially weird. During her lifetime, Matilda famously remained unmarried. After her first brief union ended with a husband she seemed to regard more like a paperwork issue than a person. She refused all subsequent suitors, royal, noble, ecclesiastical, all of them. Even when marriage could have secured more territory or political advantage, she said no. Every time, with increasing sharpness. And then there's the chapel. Located at the top of the fortress, small, circular, and filled with carved stone figures of women. Some biblical, some anonymous, and at least one who looks suspiciously like the same face repeated in several poses. Veiled, bare-shouldered, crowned. The locals called it La Stanza delle Regine, the Chamber of Queens. Not because queens prayed there, but because rumour had it Matilda hosted rituals there. Now, ritual is a loaded word. It could mean prayer, or something a lot less platonic. One legend, preserved in oral tradition long after the text vanished, speaks of a night when Matilda and 3 women cloaked in crimson stood in a circle within the chapel, palms painted with ash, each one pledging loyalty not to a man or a church, but to each other, a union of spirits sealed with touch. It was called the Oath of Quiet Flame. Sounds poetic, sounds fictional. Except there's a single tile in the chapel floor, oddly discoloured and slightly raised. You lift it. Beneath, etched into the stone, 3 initials, the last one unmistakably an M. Now let's get scholarly for a second. Most traditional historians insist Matilda's emotional connections with women were spiritual, that she was too devout, too political, too busy to engage in sensual relationships. But more modern academics, especially queer theorists, are starting to read between the lines, and what they see isn't just a single woman out of place, but an entire structure of alternative relationships that slipped beneath the church's radar. Or maybe Matilda created her own rules entirely, neither nun nor wife, neither bride of Christ nor servant to any man, just Matilda. Quirky fact. A 12th century chronicler records that Matilda once trained her female attendants in swordplay, not for defence, for show. She would dress them in light armour, dyed violet, and stage mock battles in the courtyard, declaring the winner her equal in courage and closeness. The final duel always ended with the same gesture, Matilda unstrapping her gauntlet and handing it over. The symbolism not lost on anyone. And then there's the infamous meeting at Canossa, in 1077, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV came barefoot in the snow to beg forgiveness from Pope Gregory VII. It was Matilda's castle, her mediation, her hospitality. She's portrayed in paintings standing to the side, demure, modest. But letters suggest she was the actual architect of that humiliation, that the Pope wouldn't have received Henry without her, that she staged it. And one extremely rogue historian once proposed that her quiet satisfaction that day wasn't just political, it was personal. A queen orchestrating the submission of a king, surrounded by women who bowed to no one. You stand now in her old sleeping chamber, where a single iron torch flickers against the damp wall. The bed frame is gone, but the floor still bears marks, where rugs were nailed down, where a chest was dragged. You notice something strange. 4 iron rings bolted into the stone, 2 near the wall, 2 at the foot of where the bed would have been. Decorative? Maybe. Or maybe Matilda had her own version of diplomacy. She died without a husband, without a scandal, buried with full honours. The Pope himself called her the most faithful daughter of the Church. But the Church never opened her chest of letters to the public, and the nuns who preserved her chapel sealed its doors for nearly 300 years. You exit through the rear courtyard. The fog has lifted slightly, and you see the Tuscan hills rolling like soft bodies under silk. A breeze carries the scent of lavender and old metal. Matilda ruled like a man, loved like no one dared name, and kept her oath silent, sealed in stone. And tonight, you think, she's still watching. You're sweating before you even step inside. The heat in Bari wraps around you like silk soaked in vinegar. Sticky, sour, sharp with the scent of citrus trees and something more metallic underneath. Southern Italy, mid-1500s. You're entering the world of Queen Bona Sforza. And if that name doesn't immediately ring alarm bells, don't worry, it will. This isn't just court intrigue and uncomfortable dinner parties. This is murder by lemon cake, seduction by bath water, and a legacy so tangled in poison it might as well be perfume. Bona is originally from Milan, born into the infamous Sforza family, known for ruthlessness, art patronage, and very suspicious accidents involving stairs. She marries into the Polish-Lithuanian throne, becomes Queen Consort of Poland, then regent, then something much darker. But before all that, before the treaties and titles, she develops a taste for 2 things, power and privacy. She doesn't trust easily, doesn't confide. She builds her world like a locked cabinet, everything in its place, everyone labelled and laced with obligation, which brings you to her bath. The records say she bathed daily. That alone is enough to raise eyebrows in the 1500s. But Bona didn't just bathe, she ritualized it. Rose oil, olive oil, crushed amber, powdered pearl, and a little something else. Something only her personal apothecary prepared, behind locked doors. Some called it a rejuvenating mix. Others whispered it was an aphrodisiac. The formula was never written down. When the apothecary died suddenly, no replacement was ever found. She took these baths not alone, but with guests, usually women, usually ones she was grooming for her inner court, ambassadors' wives, visiting duchesses, even the occasional noble widow. One Venetian observer called her baths an academy of etiquette and temptation. There are letters describing young women returning from these experiences changed, more confident, more bold, wearing colours they would have never dared wear before. One bishop described it bluntly: she washes them clean of modesty. And then there's the footnote in a Polish diary that describes a long glistening cord hidden beneath the water. That line is never explained, it just sits there, daring you to wonder. But Bona didn't stop at oils and whispers. She used her intimate space to forge alliances and sever them, literally. One infamous night in Krakow, a minor nobleman who had been invited to her private chambers for an evening consultation was found dead in a hallway the next morning. Heart attack, they said. Except his lips were blue, his eyes wide open, and his last known meal had been cake, served warm, with lemon. The lemon cakes became legendary. Sweet, fragrant, impossible to resist, and dangerous. Over time, nobles began to refuse them politely at dinners, even when starving. A superstition developed. If the queen offers you lemon, say a prayer. Modern historians argue there's no proof she used poison deliberately, but if she didn't, she certainly cultivated the myth. At one banquet, she reportedly laughed as she cut a lemon open with a jewelled dagger and said, Only the sour know how to sting sweetly. Let's talk about lovers. Officially, there were none. Unofficially, there's the case of Jan Tarnowski, her military commander and political ally. Their letters are stiff and formal until 1 year, 1537, when they shift. Suddenly there's poetry, verses about heat and hands and silk undone in the moonlight. One line reads, "Your scent follows me from the campaign to the bath." He was married, she was regent. Nothing confirmed. But shortly after, his wife took ill and never recovered. And Bona's court portrait from that same year shows her wearing a sapphire brooch identical to one from Tarnowski's family crest. Coincidence? Maybe. But you're standing in her private gallery now, and that painting is the only one where her lips are parted. A curious fact. She was obsessed with medicinal herbs, grew them herself, catalogued them in a personal journal that historians still haven't fully deciphered. There are symbols instead of names. A black dot over a leaf sketch means deadly. A small cross means reversible. One plant resembling nightshade has a note beside it in Latin, for those who must forget their sins before confessing. Interpret that however you like. Bona eventually returns to Italy in her later years, rich, widowed, and rumoured to be more dangerous than ever. Her servants feared her, her cooks whispered about her mood swings, and when she died, suddenly of course, her personal physician vanished, just gone. The Crown investigated. Nothing found, except an empty vial near her bedside. Scholars now fight over her legacy. Some call her a reformer, a powerful ruler who modernised courts, promoted agriculture, and brought the Renaissance to Poland. Others say she was a manipulator who ruled with perfume and poison, seduced with oil and fear. There's an entire academic conference devoted just to her bath rituals. No, seriously. You return to her bathing chamber one last time, it's still warm. The stone floor polished smooth by centuries of barefoot steps. A marble bench sits beside the tub, its edge stained darker than the rest. An apothecary shelf holds a single unmarked bottle. Empty, fragrant, sharp. You breathe it in and immediately regret it. The room spins just a little, and from the far corner you hear the faint splash of water. You turn, no one there, just steam. And a smile carved into the marble basin, worn smooth with time but unmistakable. Queen Bona never needed an army to kill you, she just needed you to say yes to cake. You're somewhere in Castile again, but this time the stone feels heavier, not ancient, claustrophobic. The air is stale, thick with incense and something faintly sweet that doesn't belong here. Something like decay. You've stepped into the cold, silent heart of one of Europe's most unsettling royal legends, Joanna of Castile. History calls her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, but tonight you're going to see why madness might have just been a convenient excuse for something far stranger, and far more intimate than anyone ever wanted to talk about. She was the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, yes, those two, born into political greatness, schooled in theology, languages, statecraft, but they never expected her to rule. She wasn't the favourite, then one sibling dies, then another. Suddenly, Joanna is heir to the most powerful empire in Europe. And she's married off to a Habsburg prince, Philip the Handsome, which frankly sounds like a name chosen by someone trying too hard. He was charming, manipulative, utterly vain, and Joanna, she loved him so fiercely it practically scorched the paper her letters were written on. At first, the marriage is passion. Obsessive passion. They barely leave their bed for the first week. Courtiers joke that she doesn't let him out of her sight, and then they stop joking because it's true. She grows territorial, controlling. When she finds him flirting, which he always does, she reportedly assaults the other women. One servant writes that Joanna grabbed a lady-in-waiting by the hair and dragged her across the hall, in public, during Mass. Another account says she demanded her husband's doublet be burned after a noblewoman touched it. To purge the fabric of betrayal, she supposedly said. Then Philip dies. Here's where things slip into darkness. Officially, it's sudden illness. Unofficially, poison. Some say Joanna did it. Others say his enemies did. All that's certain is this. She doesn't take it well, at all. You're led down a winding stone passage now, into what used to be a hunting lodge. but was for a time Joanna's private chapel, or prison, depends on how you look at it. Inside, a single stone slab sits in the middle of the room. The edges are worn, smooth, like someone once paced in tight circles around it, because that's exactly what Joanna did. When Philip's body was placed in a coffin, she refused to bury him. She ordered it sealed, then had it transported with her, night after night through the countryside. Always watched, always guarded. If a town refused her entry, she slept outside, with the coffin. When she was forced to rest in monasteries, she demanded the coffin be placed beside her bed. At one point, she had it opened, just to look. And here's where things move past grief and into the realm of deeply uncomfortable. Multiple accounts, not gossip, not rumour, but actual court documents, suggest Joanna lay beside the coffin. Not once, not briefly, night after night. She'd insist on privacy. Curtains drawn, guards dismissed. One monk wrote, trembling, "We were not permitted to pray, for she claimed he still listened to her breath." Another in Latin simply wrote, "She whispered too closely to the mouth of the dead." Was she mad? Delirious with loss? Or something else? Some historians defend her fiercely. They argue that Joanna was never insane, that she was slandered by her father, and later by her son, Charles V, both of whom had every reason to declare her unfit. Why? Because as long as she lived, she was the legitimate ruler. Declaring her mad kept her locked away and them on the throne. Others take a different view, that her obsession with Philip turned pathological, that her sensuality, once directed entirely at him, had nowhere else to go, and no one brave enough to touch it. She didn't stop loving him, not when he cheated, not when he died, not when his body began to rot. Quirky fact. She travelled with his heart in a casket, separate from the body, a small ornate box lined with velvet, which she insisted be placed at her bedside even after she was confined to Tordesillas. She reportedly opened it at night and sang lullabies to it. Actual lullabies. You're in Tordesillas now, the final prison palace where she spent the last 46 years of her life. No visitors, no letters, just her memories, and, possibly, what remained of Philip's body until it was finally quietly buried against her wishes. Her room is small, cold, the window is barred, but the bed still sits in the corner, and the wall beside it bears faint scratch marks. 4 vertical lines, then 1 diagonal. 5, over and over. No one knows if she made them, but someone did. One of the most unsettling artifacts here is a comb, ivory, cracked with age, but still intact. It was found tucked into her mattress. Alongside it, a piece of silk embroidered with the letter P. No context, just that. The open scholarly debate never really ends. Was Joanna truly mad, or was she devastated by grief and punished for being a woman who refused to let go of what she loved, literally and absolutely? Some argue she was dangerously obsessed, others say she was a victim of politics, and a third group, small, serious, often laughed out of conferences, claim she blurred the line between love, mourning, and sensual possession in a way no one else in European royalty dared. As you stand there, the air feels too still, like the room is waiting for another confession, another night, another whispered breath. She's long gone now, but something lingers, a lesson, maybe. That love, when left untended, can rot, but obsession finds ways to outlast the flesh. And tonight, you wonder what she saw in the face of her dead husband, and whether in the quietest moments he ever whispered back. You arrive in Edinburgh under a low, moaning sky. The clouds hang heavy like mourning veils, and the wind carries the smell of smoke and damp velvet. Stage dressing for the next queen on your journey. This one's dramatic in every way, from her life to her lovers to the string of corpses she left behind, real or rumoured. You're stepping into the shadow of Mary, Queen of Scots, and if you've heard the sanitised version, the tragic queen in pearls and piety, prepare yourself, that Mary doesn't live here. This one's masked, laughing and walking you straight into a masquerade where every dance step is a power play and every whispered promise ends in scandal. Mary returns to Scotland in 1561 after growing up at the French court, a court soaked in opulence and a little too comfortable with decadence. She brings that atmosphere back with her. Lace, perfume, French gowns cut slightly too low for Presbyterian comfort. The Scottish nobles blink hard and mutter about modesty. Mary smiles sweetly and invites them to dinner. The Queen is beautiful, intelligent, multilingual, and according to her critics, utterly improper in the hours after dusk. Her court becomes infamous for its tableaux vivants, elaborate masquerade parties where courtiers dress as mythological gods, exotic animals, or famously ill-fated lovers. Mary always plays the goddess. Sometimes Artemis, sometimes Venus, sometimes, just to twist the knife, she plays herself, wearing a gown that matches her royal portrait while watching others act out scenes from her life, slightly altered. A veiled queen on a balcony, a forbidden kiss in a chapel, a masked murder. Yes, murder. Because nothing about Mary's sensuality is passive. She's not a consort trailing behind a more powerful man. She's the one people orbit, and sometimes burn up trying to get close to. Which brings us to Lord Darnley. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, is Mary's cousin and second husband. He's tall, good-looking, and deeply unstable. They marry fast against her advisor's warnings, and the court erupts in gossip. The rumours swirl she's bewitched by his beauty, or its politics, or, according to one French source, it's because Darnley had a body like Apollo and knew how to worship. That line is underlined in the margin of a bishop's copy. No one asks why, but things sour quickly. Darnley becomes jealous, violent, controlling. He drinks too much, threatens her counsel, and then he has Mary's closest advisor, David Rizzio, dragged from her private chamber and stabbed to death in front of her, while she's pregnant. And here's where it gets messy. Because not long after, Darnley dies too, blown up in his residence under extremely suspicious circumstances. His body is found in the garden, strangled, not burned. The house was, but he had apparently escaped the blast, only to be murdered. The official inquiry goes nowhere. The unofficial consensus, Mary knew, maybe even approved. And the man blamed for the murder, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, he becomes her third husband. Yes, really. Now, whether that marriage was consensual is debated. Some say she was abducted, others that she planned it. Some modern historians frame it as assault, others say it was a calculated alliance. What's undeniable is that Mary's relationship with Bothwell was passionate, consuming, and deeply unpopular. The nobles rebel, she's forced to abdicate, imprisoned, escapes, then imprisoned again, this time in England. But we're not here just for the history. We're here for the details, the shadows behind the stained glass. There's a surviving inventory of items from Mary's personal effects made during her imprisonment in England. Among the rosaries and books are 3 masks. One is painted with weeping eyes, another with an open mouth stitched shut in thread. The third, blank, just polished ivory, cold to the touch. These weren't theatrical props. These were for private use, perhaps during her famous masquerades, or perhaps, as one cryptic note suggests, for ceremonies of solitude. Quirky fact. Mary had a hidden chamber in her Holyrood Palace apartment, accessible only through a narrow hallway behind a hanging tapestry. It contained a single chair, a writing desk, and a mirror, too small to be useful but perfectly positioned to reflect the doorway. A spy's mirror, or a lover's. We don't know. And then there are the letters. Ah, yes, the casket letters. A series of love poems and passionate notes allegedly written by Mary to Bothwell. They're wild, sensual. In one she writes, "I cannot sleep without imagining your body upon mine, the weight of your breath keeping me from drifting to sin." The authenticity of the letters is still fiercely debated. If real, they're evidence of a woman so caught in desire that she threw away her crown. If fake, they're a masterclass in political character assassination. Either way, they worked. Mary lost everything, her throne, her freedom, eventually her head. But before that, before the axe, before the prayer, before the clean slice, she spent 19 years imprisoned in various English castles. And during that time, she still dressed with care, still wore perfume, still wrote poetry, still sent secret messages sewn into tapestries with invisible ink. One maid confessed that Mary whispered dreams aloud in her sleep. She murmured names we never heard by day, the maid said, and sometimes laughed or wept. The scholarly debate, of course, is endless. Was she a reckless romantic, a cunning manipulator, a victim of her gender, or an architect of her own ruin? The truth probably is all of it. You're standing in what remains of her private room at Lochleven Castle. The walls are bare, the floor uneven, but the window is exactly where it always was, a narrow slit with just enough moonlight to cast a long shadow across the room. You follow it. It leads to a notch in the stone. Inside, a carved rose. The petals are almost worn away, but the stem remains. Sharp, purposeful. Mary didn't hide her sensuality. She wore it like a weapon, and in the end, she lost. But she never played by anyone else's rules, not the church's, not the crown's, and certainly not history's. So as you leave the room, you glance back one last time. The wind picks up, and for a moment, you swear you hear music. A slow waltz, masked footsteps, laughter too close to crying. Another masquerade, and she still hasn't taken off her mask. The walls of the Louvre close in around you. Not the elegant art museum we know today, but the older, harder version of it. Before the renovations, before the Monet prints and gift shops, it's the late 1500s, and France is a pressure cooker of religious war, blood feuds, and very expensive perfume. You're standing in the heart of the Valois court, and tonight's main character is Catherine de' Medici, Queen Mother, political puppeteer, and mastermind of one of the most seductive intelligence networks in European history. You've heard of spies in ballrooms, sure, but this is next level. Catherine didn't use coded letters or cloaked men in alleyways. She used women, beautiful, intelligent, and very willing women. They were called les escadrons volants, the flying squadron. Sounds elegant, right? Like a fencing troupe or maybe a dance ensemble. No, these were Catherine's personal elite unit of courtesans. Yes, that kind of courtesan. Except their talents extended beyond seduction. They were trained to observe, to listen, to extract information through pleasure and pillow talk. And Catherine, she was their director, their tutor, their queen. Let's rewind. Catherine married into the French royal family as a teenager. She wasn't supposed to matter much. An Italian outsider, overshadowed by her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers. But then her husband dies, and one by one, her sons take the throne. Young, weak, often sick, and always under her watchful eye. Catherine steps forward, not as regent officially, but unofficially, she runs everything. She wears black almost exclusively. Mourning garb, yes, but also a clever branding choice. The court whispers about her, that she communes with astrologers, that she dabbles in alchemy, that she speaks to spirits, all possibly true. But it's the flying squadron that really cements her legacy as the queen of soft power. You walk through a side hall of the Louvre, narrow, quieter, probably once used by servants or people trying not to be seen. This is where the ladies would pass after hours, veiled, perfumed, instructed. They weren't random courtiers. Catherine selected them personally. They had to be literate, poised, capable of making a prince or ambassador think he was the clever one, while gently unwrapping his state secrets along with his buttons. There's a journal, preserved in a private collection, supposedly belonging to one of these women. In it she writes, "Madame instructed us to smile often, blink slowly, and never ask questions, only offer silence that invites answers." Another line reads, "I danced with a Huguenot duke tonight. His mouth betrayed more than his letters ever could." It's written in code, yes, but not the kind that hides numbers. It hides bodies. The most infamous member of the squadron, Charlotte de Sauve. She was sent to seduce King Henry of Navarre, later Henry IV of France. She succeeded spectacularly. But she was also simultaneously involved with the Duke of Alençon and possibly the Duke of Guise. A triple threat. The court called her the Sieve because everything that went into her eventually leaked back to Catherine, diplomatically speaking. Now, this wasn't just about espionage. Catherine understood the weaponization of sensuality. She choreographed entire masquerade balls, called ballets de cour, where costumes, music and lighting were used to create situations ripe for entanglement. One such event, recorded in exquisite detail by a Flemish diplomat, included a theme of Garden of Earthly Delights, The women wore sheer dresses covered only by painted ivy leaves. The men, robes that tied in the front, poorly. The night reportedly ended with more alliances forged in beds than at the negotiating table the next day. A strange but real artifact survives from this era. A carved ivory comb bearing Catherine's initials on one side and a Latin phrase on the other. Lingua mentitur, corpus numquam. The tongue may lie, but the body never does. It was likely gifted to one of her ladies, perhaps a token of completion, a graduation gift, if you will. But was it all just scandal for the sake of statecraft? That's where scholars divide. Some argue Catherine was simply doing what male rulers had done for centuries, using pleasure to manipulate power. Others see her as a villainess, corrupting the morality of court life. The more nuanced takes acknowledge the brilliance and brutality of a woman in a male-dominated world who used the only tool she was allowed to wield without immediate execution, the allure of the feminine body. What gets lost in the morality debate is the agency of the squadron itself. These weren't victims. Many rose to great power, married well, retired into wealth and status. Some historians argue the network gave them more freedom than traditional marriage ever could. There's a letter, unsigned but preserved, where one woman writes, "I have had more choice than any duchess. My heart is not untouched, but my mind is unbound." Catherine kept everything secret. No official logs, no records, just rumours, the occasional intercepted letter, and court paintings that, if you look closely, seem to include too many women standing a little too close to men in corner shadows. One, stored in a dusty gallery of Versailles, shows Catherine in black lace smiling faintly. In the background, a woman in red lifts a goblet to a man's lips. He leans in. His eyes are already closing. You leave the hallway and step into a sunlit room. Catherine's old private quarters. On the mantel, a small glass vial. Empty. Labelled simply musk. Musk. Used for perfume. And sometimes for potions. Or poisons. She died with a crownless head but absolute control over her image. No one ever proved she had anyone assassinated, or seduced, or drugged, but they feared her all the same. And maybe that was her final lesson. Seduction is never about the act, it's about the effect. And her effect, still echoing. You walk away, heart thudding. Behind you, the hallway seems longer than before, and someone, somewhere, is still listening. The silk shifts again, this time to red, deep, imperial, and glowing like coals under candlelight. You're in Chang'an, ancient China, during the height of the Tang dynasty. The year is somewhere in the 690s, though time feels slippery here, suspended between incense smoke and ritual. The air is heavy with camphor and rose, the walls are lacquered in obsidian and jade, and all eyes, every trembling courtier, every scheming minister, every hardened general, are on her, Empress Wuzetian, the only woman in Chinese history to officially rule as emperor, and she didn't get there by being soft. You walk the marbled halls of the imperial palace and feel it instantly. The stillness, the weight. This isn't a court, it's a stage. And Wu? She's the playwright, the director, and the lead actor in a production that has already outlasted half her enemies and will outlast most of her friends. She began as a low-ranking concubine to Emperor Taizong, but after his death she somehow re-entered the palace under his son, Emperor Gaozong. Technically, she wasn't supposed to. Widowed concubines weren't allowed to remarry or re-enter court life, but Wu never asked for permission. She simply arrived and everyone else adjusted. What followed was a slow, sensuous coup draped in silk. She rose through the ranks, became Empress Consort, then Regent, then Emperor in her own right. But you're not here just for the titles. You're here for the whispered stories that court scribes edited out. The ones burned, buried, or smudged from scrolls, but not forgotten. Start with the secret palace, the Ganlu Hall, or Hall of Sweet Dew, tucked behind the main throne room. It doesn't show up on official maps, but it's there. Inside, red lacquer panels, a perfumed bathing chamber, and a raised dais where Wu reportedly kept her personal attendants, a group of carefully chosen young men trained in poetry, etiquette, and more physical arts. These weren't eunuchs. They were selected for their beauty, their discretion, and their loyalty. Historians often refer to them as musicians or readers, but there are memoirs, fringe, almost entirely suppressed, that describe midnight summons. One official, writing anonymously after fleeing the capital, claimed he was once invited to a poetry reading in the Ganlu Hall, only to discover more groans than verses, and skin so perfumed it made the tongue forget language. There's even a particular term that was whispered in elite circles: bedside examinations. It referred to Wu's habit of evaluating new male courtiers in private. On what grounds? Intelligence, surely. Demeanour, of course. But according to one banned commentary, those who pleased with their mouths found themselves promoted swiftly. Double entendre. Not even subtle. Now here's the quirk that lingers. Wu commissioned a special incense blend. Her personal scent. It was reportedly made from ground lotus petals, clove, sandalwood, and a rare musk oil imported from the western regions. A court record mentions that the scent was so strong it clung to her chamber curtains for weeks after she left. One ambassador claimed it caused clouded judgment and wet dreams. Again, his words, not ours. But was this all real, or the invention of Confucian chroniclers desperate to smear a woman who seized a man's role? That's the debate. The mainstream view insists Wu's legacy was marred by patriarchal panic, men terrified that she not only ruled, but ruled better than they ever had. She passed fairer civil service reforms, promoted Buddhist philosophy over Confucian hierarchy, and even made efforts to include women in government. So naturally her enemies accused her of sex cults and perverted rituals. Still, there's a record of a summer banquet held during her reign, in which guests were required to attend barefoot, wear robes of translucent silk and answer questions in verse. Failure to be eloquent, punishable by demotion. Success, sometimes rewarded with an invitation to the Ganlu Hall. One court artist drew a depiction of the banquet's final hour, where masked dancers, male and female, performed a ritualized story of moonlit union between star and flame. And who played the flame? Wu herself, standing at the centre, her robe dyed the same red as the hall's panels. And then there's the shrine. Hidden behind the palace garden, past the lotus pond, stands a tiny stone structure Wu had built after becoming emperor. Inside it, a single statue, a naked woman with tiger claws, wings and eyes made of black pearl. It doesn't match any Buddhist or Taoist iconography. Some think it's a forgotten goddess from an older, earthier religion. Others believe it's a self-portrait, an embodiment of her dual power. One inscription on the shrine's pedestal reads, "She who burns and births." You leave the shrine and head to her private audience chamber. The chair is still there, simple, low-backed, carved with phoenixes. The room is narrow, intentionally so, forcing visitors to kneel or crawl. One general complained that the empress had a habit of smiling too long before speaking. Others say she would sit in silence, letting the scent of her incense do the intimidating. But here's where things soften. One diary, written by a palace maid who survived 3 emperors, remembers Wu writing poetry at dawn, sometimes naked, sometimes humming, her hair unpinned and cascading like night down her back. The maid writes, she sang to herself like a girl, then silenced the world like a god. Wu Zetian died peacefully in her bed at the age of 80, a feat in itself. She was buried with full honours beside the man whose throne she took, and improved. Her tombstone was left blank. No inscription, no name. Some say it was out of shame. Others say it was her final flex. Let the world wonder. So now you stand in the Ganlu ruins. The red paint faded, the incense long burned out, but the floor beneath your feet is smooth, worn, as if many knees once knelt here willingly, and somewhere in the silence you smell a trace of sandalwood. Or maybe it's your imagination. Either way, she's still here. Not just the empress, the fire, the breath between verses, the woman who rewrote the rules and made sure history would never agree on what she did behind closed doors. You're standing on cold flagstone, bare feet against stone polished smooth by centuries of penitent pacing. The walls around you are narrow, almost womb-like, and the air tastes of old wax and something older still. Iron, maybe? A hint of mould? You're in Burgundy now, 11th century France, in a nunnery-turned-palace-turned-whispered scandal. Because the woman who lived here began as a bride of Christ and ended up queen of one of Europe's messiest dynasties. Her name is Clotilde, though the records vary. Some call her Clotildis, others call her nothing at all, as if her name itself was too dangerous to preserve. But her story, Oh, that still smoulders. She was born highborn, cloistered young, and expected to stay veiled and out of sight forever. The Benedictines called her pious. The villagers called her the Swan. No one asked what she wanted. That mistake wouldn't be made twice. As the story goes, a king, recently widowed, aging but not too old to think with his crown jewels, visited the convent to make a donation. Clotilde greeted him in the chapel. She was supposed to bow, murmur blessings, and return to her cell. Instead, she asked him about his wars. She quoted scripture that contradicted his policies. She smiled when he lost the thread of his reply. They were married within a month. The church was furious. A nun cannot marry, they cried. It is sacrilege. But the king waved his hand, the pope found a loophole, and Clotilde was removed from the convent with as much ceremony as if she'd been canonized rather than uninhabited. The nuns wept. One threw a shoe at the departing carriage. Clotilde never looked back. Her royal chambers became infamous almost immediately. They were arranged like a cloister, 4 rooms in a square, each themed. The first was for prayer, simple, dark, cold. The second for reading, books of psalms and poetry, often open to pages on longing. The third was a bathing chamber, filled with herbs and perfumed steam. And the fourth, that one was locked. Always. A maid, dismissed after only a week, later wrote of strange markings on the floor of that 4th room. Circles. Symbols she couldn't read. A low padded bench with leather straps, one broken as if by force. A candle made of something too soft to be beeswax. And gloves. Dozens of them. Not for warmth, for play. Was it true? That's always the question. The official accounts record Clotilde as moderate, measured, devoted to her husband. But behind the diplomatic phrases lie odd details. The king stopped attending mass. He was often late to council meetings, emerging dishevelled, silent, with the faint smell of rosewater clinging to his collar. He began gifting foreign envoys with velvet blindfolds embroidered with his crest. A joke? A warning? No one ever asked. And then there's the confessor. Each queen had one, a priest assigned to guard her spiritual health. Clotilde went through 4 in 2 years. One wrote a panicked letter to a bishop claiming she demanded confession by touch. That she asked him to remove his robe while reciting his sins so nothing would obstruct divine truth. He was transferred to a distant abbey and later claimed he'd seen her in a dream, winged and laughing. She reformed convents. She sponsored hospitals. She treated the plague with a balm made of rosemary, honey, and, according to one recipe, crushed garnet. She also supposedly held monthly midnight gatherings in her old nunnery, now converted into a retreat for spiritually exhausted noblewomen. The official documents list prayer services, but a surviving guest list includes several women known for their unmarried persistence, and one duchess later executed for treason after being caught with a coded letter sewn into her bodice. The letter, preserved in a court archive, contains a phrase: "The Queen's touch leaves no bruises, only lessons." So what was Clotilde? A former nun who found power in flesh? A holy woman who believed pleasure and prayer weren't opposites? Or something more radical? A queen who transformed her own body into a sacred space, dictating its use with the authority of both the church and the crown? That's the scholarly split. The traditionalists say she was scandalous, corrupted by power, and dangerous in her theology. The progressives argue she was reclaiming feminine agency in an age of total male domination. And the fringe camp, they say she was quietly building a movement, a network of noble women, widows, and ex-nuns who were rewriting the rules of devotion behind closed doors. A curious artifact stored in a Burgundian abbey lends weight to the theory. It's a Book of Hours, standard medieval devotional fare, except every illuminated capital shows a woman in motion. Unbound hair, exposed ankles. One even shows a pair of hands tied at the wrist, resting on a lap. That's not a scribal error, that's deliberate iconography. And then there's the final note in her will, written in her own hand, smudged at the edges but still legible. "Let no man claim my body for virtue or sin. It is mine. It has always been mine." You're standing now in the remnants of her private chapel. The frescoes are faded, the air thick with mildew and incense, but one wall still holds a shape, a ghost of a mural. It shows a woman seated on a throne, wearing both a crown and a nun's veil. Her eyes are closed. Her mouth is open in either song or prayer. or something else. The floor is colder now. The wind picks up through the broken glass of the lancet window. You step back just once before turning away. Because whatever Clotilde was doing in her fourth chamber, she was doing it on her own terms, and sometimes that's the most dangerous prayer of all. The wind hits harder here, slicing across the open steppe like a whip. You're in Mongolia now, in the 13th century, where the sky is wide enough to swallow entire empires, and the air smells like sweat, leather, and the last campfire smoke of a warband that just moved on. There are no marble palaces, no candlelit chapels, just yurts, rounded, warm, quiet from the outside but humming within, and inside one of them, a woman unlike any queen you've met so far. Her name is Bertin, or maybe Cutulun, depending on which scroll you believe. The records blur, blend, fracture. But one thing is constant, this queen left bruises on men, on history, and maybe, just maybe, on herself. Start here. Not all queens rule with sceptres, some with arrows, some with contracts, but Berta's legacy, if that's who you're with, is laced with the scent of horsehair and blood. She was Genghis Khan's first and most senior wife, a woman whose political influence was quiet but absolute. He consulted her, slept beside her, trusted her counsel in matters of war and, according to one surprisingly specific Persian chronicle, also trusted her to apply his war paint. Yes, she painted his face before battle, not a servant, not a general, her. Now, whether we're speaking of Berta or Cutulun, or some historical synthesis of both, what comes next is the stuff of either legend or very well concealed truth. Because one of them, possibly both, was tattooed. Not decorative tattoos, not dainty ankle swirls. We're talking full-back markings, war trophies inked into skin. One Chinese account describes a Mongol noblewoman bearing the dragon's eye upon her shoulder, surrounded by the 9 stars of conquest. Another source, this one Arabic, tells of a female warrior who wore a scorpion tattooed on the inside of her thigh. A symbol of her kiss and her strike, the poet writes. You feel like that says it all. And then there's the wrestling. Cutulun, Genghis's great-granddaughter, or possibly Berta's warrior descendant, was famed for challenging her suitors to wrestling matches. Not dances, not poetry contests. Full-on chest-to-chest body slam wrestling. If they lost, they forfeited a horse. If they won, well, no one ever did. By the time she was 25, she reportedly had 10,000 horses and 0 husbands. Eventually, under family pressure, she married. But the message was clear. If you wanted her, you had to earn her, physically. Publicly, and probably while gasping for air. You duck into the yurt now and it's dim, smoky, warm. The rugs are layered thick, the walls hung with furs. In the centre, a polished silver mirror rests on a low table. Strange, not decorative, utilitarian. Some scholars believe these mirrors were used for more than just grooming. They were for rituals, reflection magic, gazing, watching someone from behind. The mirror has a crack down one side, like it's been thrown, or dropped in the heat of something not entirely ceremonial. There's a story, barely documented, about a Mongol queen who seduced an enemy warlord using nothing but a cup of fermented mare's milk and a whispered riddle. He woke up days later, tied by the wrists, his face painted in her tribal colours. She let him go. His tribe surrendered within a week. Now, here's the quirky bit. This queen, let's just call her the warrior bride for now, was said to use her tattoos to seduce and intimidate. One pattern down her spine was reportedly an encrypted lineage. Each conquest, each battle, each blood alliance. You couldn't read it unless you touched it. One of her handmaidens later recounted, under extreme duress, that she would guide her chosen lovers through the markings in the dark, describing them as the only history worth memorizing. The idea of history written on skin. Brutal, brilliant, slightly arousing. Of course, this doesn't sit well with certain historians. Traditional scholars dismiss much of this as romanticised myth, born from oral epics and posthumous poetry. But more recent academic voices, especially those delving into Mongol domestic politics, argue that the blending of sensuality, power and physical dominance wasn't unusual. It was expected. Mongol queens weren't cloistered. They rode, they ruled, they fought, and yes, they took lovers, sometimes strategically, sometimes for fun. You're still in the yurt. tracing your hand along the etched bone knife on the wall. It's ceremonial, not meant for war, but the grip is worn smooth, used often, maybe during rituals, maybe something more private. There's a sleeping mat near the fire, rumpled, warm, and beside it a bowl of blackened ink. You pick it up, it smells of smoke and pine resin, tattoo ink still wet. And then, in the far corner, half concealed beneath a fox fur cloak, you see it. A small wooden box, unlocked. Inside are strips of parchment, horsehide, more likely, with symbols inked in deep red. You can't read them, but one is a hand, another a pair of lips, the third a horse, wild-eyed, galloping towards something you can't see. The scholarly debate continues. Was this woman, whether Berta, Cutulun or some hybrid, truly the sensual warrior legend she's become, or was her image twisted by time, romanticised by foreign chroniclers who couldn't imagine a woman with that much agency? There are few artefacts, fewer documents, but the oral histories from the steppe persist. Campfire songs, hushed stories, warnings to young men about what happens when a woman puts a rope in your hand and then tells you it's your turn to pull. You leave the yurt blinking into the wind. The steppe stretches forever, grass rippling like muscle under skin. Somewhere you think you hear laughter, feminine, confident, echoing. You don't know if she's still out here. But you do know she never needed a castle. She carried her power on her back, on her skin, in her ink, and in the fear and thrill she left behind. Now the wind howls colder, sharp with salt and iron, curling off the dark edges of the North Sea. You're standing in Scandinavia, late 14th century, and the sky above you is grey, not stormy, not calm, just endless. Behind you rise the thick stone walls of a castle built for siege, not ceremony. This is the domain of Queen Margaret Thurm of Denmark, and if her name doesn't evoke thoughts of desire or deviance, that's exactly how she liked it. She ruled with ice in her veins and velvet over her fists, and the most tantalising thing about her, she told the world nothing, which is why the whispers around her personal life only got louder. Margaret wasn't born to rule everything, but somehow, impossibly, she did. Daughter of King Valdemar III of Denmark, married to King Haakon of Norway, she outlived them both. Her only son, Olav, died at 17, and from that moment on Margaret never married again. She never had another child. She never took a consort. She also never gave up the throne. Instead she formed the Kalmar Union, uniting Denmark, Norway and Sweden under one crown. Her crown. Not as a regent, not as a dowager queen, as ruler. So where, you ask, is the scandal? Well, it starts with her absolute refusal to follow any of the rules other queens obeyed. No royal bedchambers shared with male courtiers. No whispered courtships. No morning walks arm in arm with any eligible noble. She travelled with a tight circle of women, slept behind locked doors, and held private councils in chambers where the men emerged pale and quiet. One account, written by a Danish envoy and later burned for political impropriety, described her as a queen in body, but a king in voice, whose fingers held firmer grip than any sword I've touched. The nickname that stuck, King Margaret. And then there's the room. Every castle she occupied had one. Small, windowless, heavily guarded. The Red Room, according to a few suspiciously consistent letters. No records exist of what happened inside, but the surviving inventory of her private effects includes iron cuffs, several weighted cords of braided silk, and one item described only as a carved rod of state. Scholars argue it was ceremonial, but the more daring among them ask, ceremonial how, exactly? Now here's where it gets strange. A legend persists across Sweden and Denmark of the Chain Queen, a shadowy ruler who could bind a man without touching him. She appears in folk tales as a ruler who demands obedience, never forgiveness, and whose kisses were cold enough to burn. Many historians brush these off as allegories, pagan holdovers, but Margaret's name appears in some of the earliest written versions, and in one, she's referred to only by a rune symbol meaning both knot and crown. The open scholarly debate around her personal life is a mess. Some argue she was asexual, focused entirely on politics and duty. Others see her as a woman who found pleasure in control, not affection. And then there's the more fringe theory, that she had a long, intensely private relationship with a noblewoman from Norway, a lady known in court documents only as Eleanor. Their names appear together in travel records more than any other court pair. Eleanor had no official title, yet received an estate, a silk-lined carriage, and her own armed escort. A love story. Maybe. Or maybe Eleanor was more than a companion, a confidant, a mirror, or something else entirely. One tantalizing document survives, heavily redacted but still legible in parts. It's a letter from Margaret to an unknown recipient, preserved in a Danish abbey. It reads, in part, "The nights are longer without your voice. I find myself waking to touch empty fabric. The winter creeps into me, but I remember your breath. You burned hotter than fire and colder than my crown. That's not political language. That's confession." Another curious relic. A wax seal recovered from one of her unused chambers. Instead of her official crest, it bears a minimalist image, 2 hands clasped, bound together by a serpent. The seal appears nowhere else in the records. No official correspondence used it, and yet it was preserved. Carefully. Hidden. You walk through her old residence now. Kalmar Castle, icy wind slipping through every crack. The throne room is austere, all stone and steel, not a scrap of fabric in sight. But her personal suite? Warmer. Just barely. The walls are panelled in deep oak, and one wall still bears faint carvings. Lines, etched in with a dagger or nail, repeated loops and notches, rope patterns, not decorative, not accidental. A code? Or just memory, scratched out in moments of silence. You sit on the edge of her old bed platform. There's no mattress anymore. But there's a shallow depression worn into the wood, human-shaped, and on the beam above, initials scratched into the frame, M+E. The scholars who argue for her celibacy say the E stands for Eric, a young noble she adopted as her heir. But he wasn't born until years after the letters were etched. Eleanor, however, was already at court. You leave the room. The hallway is dark, the torches flicker against the frost-covered stone. Somewhere above, the wind howls across the Baltic. Below, the sea churns, relentless. Margaret ruled it all, and yet she remained untouched. Unmarried, unclaimed, a queen no one ever dared to call wife. Was she cold? Maybe. Or maybe she simply preferred control over compromise. She didn't seduce. She didn't weep. But if you listen closely in the Red Room, where the walls are still warm with ghost heat, you'll hear a faint metallic clink, like chains, like silk cords, like someone still practicing the art of silent command. She ruled 3 kingdoms, without a husband, and maybe that was the kink. The Nile drips slowly beside you, black under the moonlight and thick with ancient breath. You're not in Cleopatra's Egypt, not the real one, not yet, but in the one remembered by medieval Europe, a twisted, rewritten fantasy born from papal paranoia, bardic embellishment, and a centuries-long obsession with the ultimate seductress. The Cleopatra of Roman times might have been brilliant, multilingual and politically sharp, but the medieval Cleopatra, she was something else entirely. She was a monster in lipstick, a pagan witch with a pearl between her thighs, a perverse queen, queen of perverts, and she's still waiting for you. In the minds of medieval monks and moralists, Cleopatra was not merely a ruler. She was a cosmic threat, a woman who seduced not just men but empires. Her name appears in sermons as a caution, in stained glass as a fallen Eve, and in marginalia as a curvaceous demon perched beside the devil himself. Some monks drew her with snakes for hair, others with golden chalices between her legs, ready to drown virtue in honeyed sin. They weren't writing history. They were writing lust-shame poetry with ink that barely dried before it steamed. But somewhere under the hysteria, a version of Cleopatra emerges who would have made Caligula blush. The stories get weirder the further they get from truth. One Byzantine chronicler swore she had an entire wing of her palace designed to reflect her moans into music, literally, acoustically engineered pleasure. A marble chamber with curved walls and hollow tiles, where every gasp and breath created a chorus of sound, echoing back like a living instrument. She called it, supposedly, the echo chamber, scholars scoff. But one Venetian architect in the 1400s tried to recreate it. He died penniless, obsessed. his blueprints filled with sketches of open mouths and spiral hallways. Another tale, lifted from a 13th century French morality play, tells of Cleopatra keeping a bed of mirrors, not beneath her but surrounding. Ceiling, floor, walls, even the headboard. The idea. No lover could look away, not even from themselves. It was said she whispered verses during the act, half ritual, half erotic curse. "To see me is to become me," she allegedly told a Roman senator, "and to become me is to be ungoverned." That quote? Entirely fabricated. But still, it turns up again and again. In Spanish treatises, Italian epics, German sex manuals disguised as moral instruction. By the late Middle Ages, Cleopatra had become a mythological beast stitched together from half-burnt scrolls, male panic, and forbidden illustrations. One illustration, found in the margins of a 14th century Bible, shows her lying on a chaise with two serpents curled around her thighs, licking her inner elbows. No explanation, no commentary, just a caption. Venus rediviva, Venus reborn. Was it obsession or projection? Medieval Europe had little understanding of Cleopatra's real power, the taxes she reformed, the alliances she brokered, the languages she spoke. Instead, they clung to her body. They turned her into a cautionary tale of what happens when a woman owns her desire and, worse, uses it. One particularly popular myth spread through the Dominican order claimed Cleopatra performed the perfume test on her lovers. Here's how it went. The chosen man would enter her room after fasting for a day. He would be stripped, bathed, and blindfolded. Then various oils were placed on his skin: frankincense, myrrh, musk, and one secret blend Cleopatra allegedly made herself. She would then touch each spot with her tongue, slowly, methodically, if he flinched, if he trembled, if he spoke. He was dismissed. Only those who could withstand the full ritual in silence were permitted her bed. The monks used this tale to warn against carnal indulgence. But the way they told it? Let's just say they lingered over the details. Quirky detail. One illuminated manuscript shows her holding a pearl between her lips, about to drop it into a goblet of vinegar. The infamous dissolving pearl dinner. But the artist gives her a smirk, not reverence. And the pearl, anatomically suspicious. Either that scribe didn't know what a pearl looked like, or he was making a joke the monastery librarian didn't catch. The scholarly debate is messy. Modern historians try to separate the real Cleopatra, Ptolemaic ruler, Roman power player, from the fantasy. But in doing so, they often erase the power of the myth itself, because whether or not Cleopatra had mirror rooms or seductive rituals, the very idea of her terrified medieval men. She broke their worldview, a woman who didn't just submit, but invited, who didn't cry over exile or betrayal, but offered poison with steady hands and perfect posture. That was dangerous. That was heresy. And yet, in the quiet corners of Europe, the underground thinkers, alchemists, herbalists, court midwives, spoke of her differently. They called her the flame womb, the keeper of tasteful knowledge, the final queen before the veil fell over female authority. One 15th century text, titled The Red Book of the East, and includes a recipe called the Queen's Ink. It requires pomegranate seeds, menstrual blood, and saffron. The final instruction: write only on your lover's skin. You walk now through a recreated chamber in an old Florentine villa, supposedly modelled after the Cleopatra myth. The walls are copper mirrors, the bed is round. At the centre of the ceiling, a hole for incense smoke to rise through. But the stone beneath your feet is the real treasure, etched into it. An inscription in crude Latin. She died as she lived, pressed against the edge of a blade, smiling. You don't know if Cleopatra ever smiled while dying. But the medieval version of her? She smirked her way through eternity, and she still does. The bells ring low and slow as you step into Avignon, France. Not the romantic wine-soaked version tourists love, but the 14th century seat of the Avignon papacy, where cardinals drink more wine than blood, and holy vows bend under the weight of politics. The streets are narrow, the palace looms with Gothic indifference, and somewhere behind one of those carved wooden doors is a woman who calls herself Queen without ever wearing a crown. Her name is La Papesse Jeanne, or Pope John if you ask the wrong person. But we're not here to confirm her existence. We're here to walk the razor-thin edge where faith, sex and power wore the same robe. and where heretics didn't just burn, they ruled. Now, the Church insists she never existed. Pope Joan is a myth, they say, fabricated. But the story persists, passed through whispers, songs, coded texts, and one very peculiar set of carvings in a cloister where no one wants to talk about what's really depicted. The tale goes like this. In the 800s, or maybe the 1100s, depending on the version, a brilliant woman disguises herself as a man, rises through the clerical ranks, and is elected pope. Her identity is discovered only when she gives birth during a procession, collapsing in the street while a horrified crowd looks on. Of course, that's the scandal version, the tabloid history. But in the medieval imagination, Pope Joan's story gets wilder, richer, nastier. Because in this retelling, the one that flourished behind convent walls and among repressed scribes, Joan didn't merely get exposed, she orchestrated it. Some versions say she chose her lover, a young cardinal, barely older than a boy, educated by her own hand. She called him "my lamb in wolf's wool." Their affair wasn't secret in the shadows, it was ritualized, conducted in what one record calls the 10th office, a chamber beneath the papal library supposedly used for rare manuscripts. Except instead of books, it contained cushions, censers, and a slab of obsidian polished flat. There's even mention of a mirror mass. Joan would lead her lover through mock liturgy, each psalm spoken with lips pressed to skin, each blessing a whispered command. One particularly rogue text from a German monastery, quickly banned, describes her voice during these rites as honey-laced with blade. She didn't stop there. The secret wardrobe of Pope Joan, according to certain court records, included a modified cassock, split up the sides for ease of movement. Whether for prayer or something else, the documentation is unclear. But the margins of that inventory include 2 hand-drawn symbols, the astrological signs for Mercury and Venus, joined by a chain. Was Joan real? Was she invented to shame women, or to warn them? Depends on who you ask. Traditional historians lean hard on her being a medieval allegory, a symbol of misplaced ambition. But they always get fidgety when asked about the sedia stercoraria, a real marble throne with a hole in the seat, used during papal installations. The purpose? To confirm the new pope's equipment. Why? Because they say someone once fooled them. Coincidence? Or clean-up? You enter a side chapel now, long forgotten, its ceiling blackened with candle soot. At its centre is a cracked marble basin, once used for baptisms, now dry. On the wall behind it, half concealed by layers of paint, is a figure carved in low relief, robed, crowned, and clearly, unmistakably female. Her hand rests not on a sceptre, but a scroll. At her feet, a small child, swaddled. Silent. The caption reads, "Sapientia quae non tacet," wisdom that does not keep silent. And here's your quirky fact. One 14th century French text written by a nun, anonymously of course, includes an entire chapter called the Red Litany. It's not a prayer, it's a guide. Detailed instructions on how to pray upon the body as one does upon the soul. It's attributed without source to she who sat once in Rome. The margins include erotic drawings, subtle, stylized, lips pressed to scapulars, tongues drawn in ink redder than blood. By the Renaissance, the Church had scrubbed most references to Joan. Officially, she was myth, but privately, she lingered, in mystic orders, in coded texts, in the strange knowing smiles of women who'd taken vows and still remembered what pleasure felt like in Latin. Modern scholarship remains divided. Some insist she was never real. Others argue she was based on a real woman, possibly a brilliant scholar forced to disguise herself to survive. A smaller group, usually ignored at conferences, believes she was part of a broader underground movement. Women clerics, secret lovers, occult practitioners, all moving in the dark under the Church's nose. You move now through the old corridors of Avignon's papal palace, winding toward a small library still kept locked. Inside, on a dusty shelf behind a row of official canon law books, sits a slim red volume. No title, no author. You open it. The first page reads, "I was never hidden, only denied. I ruled not in shadow but in plain sight, because you never thought to look. No one knows who wrote it, but the voice feels sharp, confident, familiar and female. You step outside. The night is heavy. The bells ring again, slow, hollow. And somewhere, maybe beneath the flagstones, the real Pope Joan laughs quietly. Not because she was found out, but because she got away with it. The light shifts again, this time golden, hot, and unrepentantly loud. The scent in the air is cumin, sandalwood, and iron-smudged dust. You're in Delhi now, in the early 14th century, under the rule of the Delhi Sultanate. The palace before you rises in sandstone waves, guarded not by statues but by memory, by rumour, by something almost unspeakable. Tonight you're stepping into the court of Razia Sultan, the only woman to ever sit on the throne of Delhi in her own right, and one whose reign was so deeply soaked in scandal and resistance that even the most loyal scribes wrote her name with caution. She was ruler, warrior, strategist, but in the stories told after sunset she was something else entirely. Something men weren't supposed to desire or fear. She wore no veil. That alone was enough to rattle the bones of every cleric between the palace and Mecca. But Razia didn't stop at unveiling her face. She dressed in royal male attire, turban, sword belt, long court coat embroidered in blood-threaded gold, not for disguise, for dominance. Her public appearance blurred lines no man dared question aloud. In private, though, they questioned everything, often with a tremble, because Razia's court was not just unusual, it was intimately defiant. The story most whispered, first in corners, then across continents, was of Razia and her chief of security, Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut, a man of Abyssinian descent, enslaved, then elevated to nobility by Razia herself. That much is true. What isn't officially recorded, only scrawled into margins, sung in underground ballads, and scratched onto the backs of merchant ledgers, is how deeply and physically entangled their relationship became. The scandal wasn't just that she loved a man beneath her station. It was that she elevated him with open favour, walked beside him through gardens hand in hand, and, according to one Persian traveller, once held court while he braided her hair. One Delhi chronicler, furious and clearly aroused, described her as an empress who conquered by sword and sin alike, who kissed her servant and commanded a kingdom with equal pressure. He died in prison for sedition. But his words survived, smuggled into a leather-bound codex that now resides in Istanbul, shelved under miscellanea, erotic political. Razia ruled with full royal authority. She led military campaigns. She negotiated treaties. She crushed rebellions. But the court couldn't stop staring at her bedroom door. Let's talk about the mirror room. It appears only once, in a document written by a tax collector turned playwright named Sharaf al-Din, who claimed to have been summoned to the palace after accidentally inflating the grain levy. Instead of punishment, he was given wine and an invitation. The room, he wrote, was hexagonal, each wall panelled in polished obsidian. In the centre, no bed, just a wide divan lined with crimson cushions and a low table set with perfume flasks, rings and silk bands. No one was tied, he noted, but everything was held. Yaqut was there, so was Razia, and so, allegedly, was a third figure, a dancer known only as Sia, whose body, Al-Din claimed, moved like smoke caught in a prayer. The details are vague, poetic, and occasionally interrupted by large ink blots. Whether from excitement or redaction, it's impossible to say. Now here's your fringe fact. In one surviving garment attributed to Razia, a ceremonial robe woven in saffron thread, there is a hidden pocket sewn into the left sleeve. Inside, researchers found a scrap of cloth bearing a single phrase in Arabic script. To be ruled is not the same as being held. No one knows who wrote it, but some suggest it was Yaqut, or maybe Sia, or maybe Razia herself, reminding anyone who reached for her that power comes in more than one form. The scholarly community, as you might guess, is deeply divided. Traditional Islamic historians describe her as devout, just, and occasionally too bold for her own good. Others argue her reign represents a rare intersection of gender, sovereignty, and sensuality, one that made her a target from the moment she tightened a sword belt over her hips. A few go further still, claiming Razia was deliberately queer-coded by her enemies to undermine her authority. After all, the story of a veiled princess is easier to swallow than that of a ruler who held court while her lover braided her hair and her rivals ground their teeth. But even those theories miss something quieter and perhaps more radical. Razia didn't just challenge gender expectations, she redefined the architecture of permission. She didn't seduce, she didn't submit, she commanded intimacy, the same way she commanded armies, with strategic patience, confident presence, and the ability to make desire feel like a form of tribute. And then, of course, came the fall. The nobles rebelled. The same ones who kissed her ring by day sharpened their daggers by night. Yakut was killed in the uprising. Razia was captured, imprisoned, and eventually murdered. Accounts vary, but most agree her body was dumped in a shallow grave. No shroud, no prayer. But here's the twist. In 1905, during railway construction near Delhi, workers unearthed an old burial chamber. Inside was a carved stone panel with a name, Razia. Beneath it, another name, worn, almost unreadable. But scholars believe it was Yakut, a joint tomb, a final rebellion against erasure. And so now, you stand in what's left of her palace. The mirror room is long gone, but the walls still whisper. The floor beneath your feet, smooth, like many silk shoes once glided over it in haste or hunger. You run your fingers along the stone. It's warm. You don't ask why. Because some queens ruled with ceremony. Razia ruled like a confession you couldn't forget. So now, as the last flickers of candlelight dim behind the 30 doors you've walked through, you can finally exhale. 30 queens, 30 thrones, 30 beds, mirrors, masks, blades and bruises. You didn't just tour royal history. You crawled through its silk-lined crawl spaces, peeked behind the brocade, pressed your ear against the stone walls of secrets that were never supposed to outlive the women who whispered them. You've watched pleasure become weapon, power become ritual, and grief coil around bodies like perfume-soaked ropes. You've seen queens who ruled from behind curtains, queens who ruled with open hands, queens who made surrender look like conquest. And if you're feeling slightly flushed or slightly unnerved, well, that's how you know you were paying attention. Because let's be honest, this wasn't a history of sex, not really. This was a history of control, of what happens when the world denies women power through the sword or the pen, so they turn to other tools. The whisper, the gesture, the grip behind the curtain, and yes, sometimes the moan that brought an empire to its knees. They were saints in velvet, heretics in lace, generals in lipstick, and none of them fit. Not then, not now. So maybe that's the point. Maybe that's why these stories still hiss between pages, centuries after the official records tried to bury them. Maybe they survive because they were never meant to be role models. They were warnings. Or maybe they were just too compelling to forget. Like a hand pressed too long to the skin, leaving a mark you won't admit you wanted. You're lying there now, probably a little wide-eyed, probably blinking at the ceiling and wondering what the hell kind of bedtime story this was. But it was yours. You made it this far, through poison and poetry, punishment and perfume, and you're still breathing, which, considering the company you've kept tonight, is an accomplishment in itself.